There are cities that seem to exist twice, once in stone and once in the imagination. Constantinople was one of them. Even now, when the name has changed and the skyline has learned new syllables, its reflection in the Bosporus still trembles with a kind of memory. To speak of the Byzantine Empire is to walk through that reflection, to pass through a mirror where Rome never quite ended, where prayers spoke Greek and laws still spoke Latin, and where the light itself seemed to have a discipline. What you are about to hear is not the story of one empire only, but the story of endurance, a civilization that stood for more than 1,000 years after its western twin had fallen, guarding libraries, recipes, philosophies, and ideas like fragile flames cupped against the wind. The Byzantines never called themselves that name. Byzantine is something later centuries invented, the way people name constellations after the stars have gone cold. To themselves they were Romaioi, Romans still, keepers of an inheritance that had crossed languages and continents but refused to surrender its pulse. Here, in this world of domes and icons, of marble floors polished by the patience of centuries, faith and empire were not two things but one long argument carried out in golden light. Hagia Sophia rose like a thought made visible, a vast bowl of air, teaching both believers and skeptics that beauty could be an act of government. Beneath that dome, voices learned to rise and fall in careful unison, each syllable tested against eternity. Outside, the streets spoke a more human register, merchants bargaining over silk, bakers turning dough that smelled faintly of olive and ash, children chasing each other past mosaics that had outlived the kings who commissioned them. The story begins, as most deep stories do, with loss. Rome, that ancient master of order, had cracked in the west, its legions gone quiet, its marble softened by moss. Yet in the east, on a slender bridge of land between Europe and Asia, something remarkable happened. Not collapse, but transformation. The empire did not die. It changed languages. It began to dream in Greek. In Constantinople, emperors who prayed with monks also argued with mathematicians. Generals who understood geometry better than their enemies wrote manuals of tactics still studied centuries later. The Byzantine Empire was Rome, after a long meditation, leaner, cleverer, slower to burn, but still proud of the idea that law and faith could share the same table. What made this empire so different, so strangely magnetic, was its ability to turn contradictions into architecture. The people who built it were heirs of Caesar, but students of Christ. They carried the discipline of soldiers and the patience of saints. They lived in an empire that believed both in heaven and in paperwork, both in prophecy and in plumbing. And somehow, against the odds of geography and invasion, they survived. Not for decades, but for a millennium. In that long 1,000 years, the Byzantine world became the crossroad of everything. Crusaders, Persians, Slavs, Arabs, Armenians, Venetians, all passed through its gates and left fingerprints on its stone. Its markets smelled of cinnamon and iron. Its politics were as intricate as its mosaics. Here, theology was not a distant abstraction, but a living debate that could make or break emperors. Here, law codes were rewritten until justice became a kind of music. And here, amid earthquakes, plagues, and sieges, people kept lighting candles, stubborn, small, unfashionable gestures of faith in continuity. Perhaps that is what keeps drawing us back. The Byzantines did not invent eternity, but they perfected the art of rehearsal. Every morning, priests rehearsed the liturgy. Every craftsman rehearsed the geometry of his trade. Every judge rehearsed the delicate balance between mercy and precedent. And every evening, the city rehearsed survival, closing its gates, checking its walls, counting its stores, waiting for the next test that would surely come. And still, in the middle of all that vigilance, there was beauty. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but a beauty that understood fatigue. Gold tesserae that caught just enough light to make a saint breathe, a choir whose notes rose like a sigh from centuries of longing, an emperor's robe stitched with the patience of nuns who would never see him wear it. To live in Byzantium was to practice attention, to notice how the divine hides inside the daily, how a single grains of incense can carry an empire's entire mood. Historians have argued endlessly about what the Byzantine Empire truly was. Some call it the last chapter of Rome, others the first draft of modern Europe, still others a bridge between civilizations that never agreed to meet. Perhaps it is all of these at once. Perhaps its truest legacy is that it refused to choose between opposites. It was both East and West, both ancient and new, both sword and psalter, both bureaucracy and mysticism, and it stood long enough for each contradiction to find its rhythm. But every endurance hides a tragedy waiting at the edge of light. In 1453, after 11 centuries of vigilance, the city met its final morning. Cannons thundered against walls that had held the world's breath for 1,000 years. And when at last those walls gave way, something far older than stone passed into silence. Yet the silence was not complete. The libraries that survived carried seeds of Greek thought into the Italian Renaissance. The monks who fled carried chants that would find new homes in Russian cathedrals and Balkan monasteries. The city's habits of patience and courtesy, of keeping dignity alive even in defeat, spread quietly into other languages and other laws. That is why we still tell its story. Not because it was perfect, it was human and therefore full of vanity and argument, but because it managed to balance heaven and earth longer than any civilization before it, because it turned endurance into art, because in a world that often mistakes noise for power, Byzantium whispers, strength is not speed, it is continuity. And maybe that is why we listen, because beneath the splendour, the scandals and the wars, there runs a steady current of something we still need. The belief that refinement is not weakness, that order can be merciful, that beauty can be practical, that an empire, like a human being, can learn to change its name and still remember its soul. Tonight, as we begin this long journey together, 20 nights under the domes and corridors of the Byzantine Empire, I invite you to slow down. Let the water between Europe and Asia move at its own pace. Let the city teach you what it taught every pilgrim who ever walked its bridges, that survival is a ceremony, and history, when listened to softly enough, sounds very much like prayer. Because somewhere between the walls of Constantinople and the sound of the sea, between Latin law and Greek light, between the fall of one world and the birth of another, there still lingers a voice, calm, exact, and patient, saying, the empire never truly ended, it simply learned to speak in other hearts. So stay a little while longer. The lamps are being lit, the marble is warm underfoot, and the story, like the city, is just beginning to breathe again. When the western half of Rome fell to a hush, its marble roads softened by weeds, its statues learning the slow grammar of ruin, another rhythm woke in the east across the Bosporus where water and city met like breath and mirror. On a tongue of land, cupped by the whispering golden horn, a second Rome rose, not an imitation, but a memory restored. They would never have called themselves Byzantines. To themselves they were Romaioi, Romans in soul, heirs to an empire that refused to end. Their capital, Constantinople, was at once fortress and vision, a tessellated dream of light, faith, and endurance. Ships from the Black Sea and the Aegean drew toward its harbours, like threads toward a single needle, bringing spices, silk, and rumours of far sovereignties. Within its walls, beneath domes that seemed to hover on incense and song, people spoke in the register of destiny. Some claimed the city's foundation was miracle more than policy, a choosing rather than a making. Constantine the Great, once a soldier with an uncertain creed, looked east and saw not merely ground but revelation. He raised his new Rome upon the bones of Byzantion and imagined a place where heaven's geometry could touch the earth. They said a strange light lingered over the harbours the day of consecration and would not fade until the final prayer was finished. Others insisted the light was human, the reflection of a will that knew how to kindle warmth from ash and keep it. In those early centuries, streets shone with marble and mosaic, libraries murmured in Greek and Latin, and the faith, born of deserts and tested by councils, sought its balance between altar and diadem. Pilgrims passed through the bronze doors of Hagia Sophia and lifted their eyes as if the dome itself were firmament. Soldiers paced the Theodosian walls, believing stone and prayer together could stall eternity. And in quiet monasteries, scribes copied not only scripture but Plato, keeping wisdom alive while kingdoms burned. It all smelled like continuity, as though time, tired of falling, had decided to rest inside these walls. Yet the people here knew, perhaps more than any before them, that eternity is not sameness. The empire learned how to bend without breaking, to molt and mend, to lose and remember. So the tale begins not with triumph, but with metamorphosis. Rome learning to dream in Greek, emperors who commanded in the language of power and knelt in the language of angels, a people poised between east and west, earth and heaven, sword and psalter. Beneath the gold tesserae and solemn chant, the old heartbeat of the forum still pulsed, slower now, deeper, wiser. This empire was not born so much as reawakened, rising where two continents join like clasped hands, where time itself lingers before it moves on. In that pause, between the ruins of one world and the dawn of another, a city of domes and relics began to breathe, ready to write 1,000 years of memory into the waiting dusk. In the pale hour before day takes its first assured breath, the city by the straits practiced its beginnings, and anyone who listened closely could still hear the older name, Byzantine, tucked beneath the newer syllables like a pressed keepsake. Fishermen pushing off from the Golden Horn murmured it to their nets, as if old names lent luck, while in palace corridors courtiers spoke of Constantine's choice with the tender certainty of people who owe their lives to a decision made long before they were born. He had come east for more than walls and water. He had come for a geometry, a triangle of seas to guard the flanks, a spine of land to carry gates and markets, horizons that could be read almost like scripture. When he consecrated New Rome, he planted not only standards but expectations, forums teased out of open ground, colonnades that taught the wind its manners, a senate encouraged to imagine continuity without pretending nothing had changed. Latin and Greek walked side by side like two elder relatives learning to share a house. In chancelleries, decrees still wore Latin's iron, while the markets sang with Greek's quicksilver vowels, and between them rose a confidence that felt at once practical and faintly liturgical, as if administration itself required incense and measured steps. Faith was not yet the single garment it would later become, but people already reached for it. From Nicaea to Constantinople, councils shaped sentences that would hold for centuries, even as emperors learned how to seat bishops without letting thrones tilt. Theodosius made Christianity the empire's common weather, and with that weather came new horizons for law and mercy, alongside new storms. Yet in the monasteries a scribe still bent to vellum, moving a careful stylus through Basil or Gregory with the same patience he gave Plato, for the soul needs many shelves if it is to keep its balance. Ships arrived as first chapters require from Trebizond, Cherson, Alexandria, pepper that taught kitchens to speak in warm consonants, papyrus ferrying letters in narrow boats of ink, gold dust that remembered another sun. Along the Mese, the long road that ran like a measured sentence through the city's body, buyers and sellers performed a kind of liturgy. Hands met, coins nodded, goods were lifted to the light as if the light itself were a notary. Beyond them, the twin line of Theodosian walls learned patience, stone schools desire, and those ramparts with ditches, towers, stairways, like folded elbows, were the city's deep breath made visible. In the Forum of Constantine, a column rose with a confidence that seemed naive until one remembered how long the empire had practiced the art of promise, to keep faith with order, to repair what time unthreads, to welcome difference without losing the thread of self. Even so, tremors ran under the marble, Gothic foederati to settle or soothe, Arian clauses to reconcile with Nicene ones, the constant arithmetic of frontiers and treasury that keeps rulers awake while the city sleeps. What steadied the heartbeat, besides bread and spectacle, was how ritual stitched the days. Processions where icons drank the morning, fasts that gave hunger a purpose, a calendar whose feast taught everyone to count time not only by harvest or tax, but by tenderness. In that tenderness, the imperial idea learned to breathe, not merely territory or titles, but continuity practiced as a habit. Rome voiced now in Greek cadence, a law code waiting to be harmonized, a public art convinced that beauty should be legible to the humble. The sea taught the rest, how to receive and remain, how to let foreign spice become local flavour without dissolving one's own tongue. Travellers said the streets knew when to fall silent. When the emperor passed, a hush bloomed like evening, born not of fear alone, but of the practiced courtesy of a city that had watched itself survive often enough to feel grateful. Under a half-built dome, one could sense the future sketched in charcoal, a church large enough to tutor the sky, a court where edicts would be gathered and recast, an academy humming with the gentle quarrels by which learning grows. And if the harbour at dawn looked like a basin of liquid pewter, that too belonged to the grammar. Under such skies, endurance wears soft colours. To the west, old Rome's stones settled into eloquent decay. To the east, this Rome rehearsed resilience, learning how to make a home from flux, because a city is also a chorus of small lives. Quieter notes persist. A candle seller who knew which wick burned steadiest for night vigils. A mosaicist turning glass and gold leaf into an argument for hope. A widow at Blackernay praying for a son stationed in some cold province. A scribe smiling when a stubborn ligature finally came right. A stable boy tracing with a straw the world's sailors, described Cilicia here, Gaul far beyond, Jerusalem, like a lantern tucked in the south. Their unremarkable fidelity made the imperial dream ordinary, which is the only way empires last. High above, in rooms where maps exhaled the dust of roads never personally walked, men and women considered what must come. Reforms, then a hand sure enough to bind scattered edicts into a code. Architects imagining a dome upheld by light, a riot that would make the hippodrome's floor feel like an argument with destiny. For now the city stood on its long threshold, teaching itself to become the keystone of centuries without forgetting the earlier arch. If you are listening in the quiet, tell me where you are and what time your night is. There's a small sweetness in knowing which clocks and skies keep us company. And if these histories in a hush feel like good company to you, you are welcome to subscribe to the entire history so that across distances our evenings might find each other again. Meanwhile the sea lifts and lowers its silver breath beside the walls, and somewhere a master of stone runs a hand along a curve, not yet built, already seeing how dawn will one day pour into it, a soft omen of a vast dome soon to rise. The city had learned to carry expectation like a lamp cupped in both hands, and expectation in time learned the intimacy of names. Justinian, who studied the empire like a difficult score and meant to bring its scattered themes into harmony. Theodora, who rose from the hippodrome's shadow to stand beside a throne with the steadiness known only to those who have felt floors tilt. Belisarius, whose campaigns moved like a measured tide along old Roman shores. In their season, the streets tasted honey and ash. The honey was order, edicts gathered, sifted and bound until the empire's law could be read as one deliberate sentence, the corpus juris civilis knitting fragments into a book that would teach judges for centuries how to hear. The ash was riot, the blues and greens, whose cheers carried neighbourhood loyalties like kindling, a winter week in 532 when kindling caught, and the shout, Nika, conquer, rose from sport to fury and drummed against colonnades, rattled the palace, set quarters alight. For days, the city was its own storm. Shutters closed, prayers braided with smoke, and whispers in the palace turned toward flight, until Theodora spoke in that uncompromising register of a woman who remembered both stagecraft and hunger, saying that a crown makes as fine a shroud as any. Better to be measured by courage than weighed by fear. Decisions followed like a keel finding the channel, the general, the tactics, the double-pronged surprise. The hippodrome learned silence again, the way a drum remembers the quiet between rolls. From ruin came building, and from building a sentence written in light. Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, its burned predecessor replaced with a nave, risen almost as quickly as stone can remember calm. Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men who thought in geometry the way sailors think in wind, drew a vault that still seems to float. When daylight first poured into that space, people said the dome hung from heaven by a golden chain. Hyperbole, perhaps, but anyone who has stood there knows why truth sometimes borrows the manners of exaggeration under certain curves. Light does not simply arrive, it is conducted, softened by marble, warmed by gold tesserae, delayed by veils, the way kindness is delayed by shyness, while the liturgy learns again its measured steps, incense climbing, invisible ladders, choirs, tracing a steady line above a city recently shaken by shouts. Taxes grumbled, as they do, yet beauty, when genuinely public, acts like a balm. A widow beneath those arcs could feel, if only for a few minutes, that the world remembered how to hold her. Scholars still debate the first dome's stresses and its partial fall, the angle of its repair. Perhaps that is fitting, for even our finest vows require revision across years. Meanwhile, the law, which rarely earns poetry, quietly reordered lives. The code did not make people good, but it made expectations around goodness less contradictory. Property, contract, marriage, guardianship, gaining a clearer grammar, so small cruelties had fewer corners to hide in. In barracks and chambers, the new compilation was read aloud like a map. Here the old way holds, here a river's boundary is drawn, here widows receive better care. In markets, tempers cooled as disputes straightened, weights were checked, scales nodded, and a butcher, who lost an argument could still feel the day had not been stolen from him. Belisarius's victories in Africa and Italy stitched old provinces briefly back to imperial cloth. Tidings like reheated bread, familiar in kind, though everyone knew winter was only offering a mild afternoon. Wars come bearing double-edged gifts, songs for those who return, empty stools for those who do not. The empire breathed through it, counting grain, counting coins, counting on the walls to keep counting enemies at a respectful distance. Beneath the grand calendar of campaigns and councils, the city kept its small fidelities, a boy in the bronze workers' quarter, cutting a tiny cross that would not blur at twilight, a chandlery perfecting a wick for night vigils, an old magistrate saving a chip of lapis for the day a dowry box needed a sky-coloured hinge, a nun memorising the recipes that coax fevers down. These are not affairs of state, yet they are how a state persuades the heart to belong. If you are awake with this story, tell me softly where your room is, perhaps a cold morning in Seattle, a warm night in Saigon, a hushed kitchen in Warsaw, where the kettle sometimes keeps time, and what hour your clock has chosen. And if this slow tapestry feels like kind company for hours, you would rather not hurry. You are gently invited to subscribe to the entire history so our evenings and mornings may recognize each other like old neighbours at the corner of a familiar street. By night, as braziers along the palace walk drew patient circles of fire, Justinian studied maps and books in the same sitting. Knowing territory and text are siblings. Theodora, whose counsel avoided vanity, moved through charities with the precision of one who never forgets a room once visited, and poorer houses learned that rulers could be distant and unexpectedly near. At the edges of that restored song, due motifs gathered, step riders testing frontiers with the calm insistence of weather, theologians shaping sentences about the natures and wills of Christ with tenderness and tension, far provinces murmuring their own arithmetic of tax and identity. The empire would not be spared argument or winter, but for a long, memory-length moment it stood beneath a dome that taught more than it sheltered, while the moon, seeing itself pale in the marble courts, took on the look of a listener who, given a story, is preparing to hand it carefully to the next night. After the great dome taught the city to breathe in unison, a quieter teacher arrived. First a murmur in barracks and cloisters, then a presence everywhere at once, a fever that walked like a shadow, tapping shoulders without ceremony. They called it the plague. Later ages would tie it to Justinian's name, though no sickness belongs to a single throne. Around 541, the city learned new measures of silence. Grain barges came heavy, not with wheat, but with hush. Marketplaces, once bright with friendly argument, thinned to a careful murmur. Candles guttered beside beds where hands forgot their errands and chose only to keep company. Chroniclers tried to count thousands in a day, some said. Others, chastened, offered smaller sums. But everyone agreed that numbers do not know how to pronounce grief. In the palace, choices still required signatures, because sorrow also demands administration. Taxes were softened, bread tallied, the army inventoried, with that earnest arithmetic empires adopt when the sky looks away. In the streets, priests and physicians took turns at thresholds, offering different remedies that were both, in their fashion, forms of tenderness. And yet, strange mercy in a wound, the city relearned the art of continuation. Ships sailed, records were kept, laws were heard. A widow found enough kindness on her lane to risk laughter once a week. Scholars will keep arguing about mortality curves and cycles, about rats, climate and trade routes, and perhaps they should, but the ones who held basins and cooled foreheads would say the lesson was simpler. The living were reminded to be careful. with one another. When the fever's tide withdrew, it left shoals. Justinian's vast energies, which had always thrown wakes of projects behind them, met a thinner treasury and provinces that preferred their own kitchens. Cracks appeared in distant walls. The empire tightened its belt and lifted its chin. Habits trained long ago, and turned again to what endures. The sea's blue logistics, the wall's patient geometry, the church's calendar where reason sits beside mercy. Even within cathedrals, however, another weather gathered. Images, icons, whose eyes seemed to understand their beholders, had grown at home on panels and walls. On the small triptychs, sailors kissed before departure. Many said these faces offered a gaze that healed by looking back. Others, stern and sincere, worried devotion might slip its rail, and that paint could trespass on honour due only to the divine. The concern arrived, not as thunder, but as a thoughtful cloud, and then, as rains turned, as a storm later named iconoclasm, causes multiplied in hindsight, austere theologies from harsh frontiers, imperial urges to discipline feeling, the moral math of defeats seeking spiritual explanation. Lived from inside, it felt more like a household disagreement carried into the square. Neighbours who had shared bread now spoke carefully. Workshops that once filled their days with saints' faces weighed the cost of hesitation. Still, many found a middle grammar, fasts kept, alms given, baptisms conducted with the same unembarrassed gladness. A mother taught a child to cross his chest as one makes a cradle, not a banner. A priest learned to preach shorter, remembering that the baker's dough could not wait. At the map's edges, winds changed names. Avars and Slavs pressed the northern fields. Arabs, swift and sure, brought a new scripture and a new courtesy of prayer. Challenge arrived with conversation. Arabic joined Greek in the markets, and merchants discovered that respect translates when tongues falter. The empire, seasoned in meeting the world, adjusted its stance, sometimes a shield raised, sometimes a tax eased, sometimes a marriage arranged like a careful bridge. In Asia Minor and across the Anatolian plateau, villages practice lightness, families packing a room's life onto 2 carts by sunset, unpacking it again by the next moon. There is a courage that does not look like battle. It looks like keeping a sourdough starter alive through 3 relocations and remembering which well runs clearest after rain. And always, behind such practical arts, the long stone sentences of the Theodosian walls reread the horizon, teaching the city that patience is its own kind of strength. Inside the capital, time braided itself into liturgy and law so that even disputes could lean on rhythm. In a scriptorium, a monk compared 2 homilies and sighed when a sentence found its truest shape. In a chancery, a notary checked the seal on a petition from a soldier's mother and felt the day notch toward justice. In the hippodrome, chariots ran again, and for an hour the city let its heart beat purely for speed and colour. The dome, repaired, revised, resumed its lesson. That grace is not the absence of weight, but the art of distributing it until weight remembers how to float. Light kept its manners, entering by high windows in slanted phrases, warming marble, persuading shoulders to release. Some nights the emperor paced, counting possibilities like beads. Some nights a dock worker slept on his folded cloak with a clean exhaustion that bordered prayer. Between those 2 sleeps lay the empire's true perimeter. If you are awake in these hours, if your room is blue, with a late screen, or softened by a lamp, tell me quietly where you are listening from, and what time your night has chosen. There's comfort in knowing which latitudes and clocks keep us company. And if these gentle histories feel like kind company, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history, so our evenings can keep finding each other across seas and weekdays. The tale isn't finished. Farther east, a monastery will soon teach an alphabet to a pair of patient brothers. To the north, a people will practice asking the sea for permission to be a nation. Within the city, a girl who learns to grind pigments to dust will one day lay down gold leaf so thin it behaves like breath. For tonight, the straits rest like polished slate. The walls hold their quiet line, and the dome, light's careful host, waits for dawn to set its first small coin of brightness on the bowl's lip, a promise, a question, a road. In the century when arguments dressed as edicts and images hid in drawers, the empire practiced a shy, durable art, remaining itself while changing its clothes. Iconoclast emperors, stern with the sincerity of men wary of misdirected love, thinned the walls and made painters hesitate. Iconodules, just as devout and disciplined, kept colour alive in smaller rooms, miniatures in margins, vestments that spoke in patterns, a saint's hand suggested by geometry when faces were forbidden. Some monasteries weathered the gale like old trees, shedding branches, keeping their rings, while others met the axe and answered only with the patience of roots. In council halls, sentences about presence and honour were swaddled with the newborn's care. In kitchens, grandmothers pressed thumbprints into Easter bread and said to no one in particular that the world remembers as much by touch as by sight. Scholars will go on weighing causes, theologies from hard frontiers, the arithmetic of monastic acres, the aftertaste of defeats. But the city's lived truth sounded simpler. Neighbours lowered their voices, shopkeepers measured words, and light, though given fewer faces to rest upon, went on easing shoulders at day's end. Then the tide turned. An empress, iron under silk, brought the icons back to daylight, and a procession that seemed to gather the whole city taught the streets to remember colour without embarrassment. Call it restoration if you like. It felt more like the return of a missing timbre, a register that let ordinary piety sing in time with ordinary grief. Beyond the walls, other melodies found their pitch. Along the Danube and across the Black Sea's travelling mirror, the Slavic world learned alphabets shaped like hospitality, letters that made room for a people's own mouth music. Two brothers, patient more than laden, translated not only scripture but the notion that the sacred can speak with the accent of home, and from that gift flowed a long grammar of kinship, liturgy in familiar syllables, rulers negotiating identity with baptismal water and ancestral pride, ideas trading alongside furs, wax and timber. On another current, the Russes came in long ships, testing the city first with iron and later with curiosity. They found markets exact, walls incurious, and a church where the sky seemed poured indoors. Chroniclers say their envoys stood beneath the dome and felt themselves neither on earth nor in heaven, which is just what such domes intend, to remind the heart of its two citizenships. Some went north with no plunder, only a recipe for a different winter, alliances, marriages, and a faith that could warm houses the way no brazier ever could. At sea, the empire's chemistry wrote bright commas across dark water. Greek fire, whose tune remained a family secret, persuading sieges to reconsider their rhetoric. On land, the themes folded farms into frontiers, soldiers who were also planters, taxes that read like duty and insurance at once, villagers drilling by the calendar as if harvest had found a second form. It was not glamorous, this knitting of soil and shield, but it taught endurance to wear work clothes, and history tends to last, where glory agrees to share tools. In the capital, a quieter brilliance gathered, scriptoria humming, scholars mending Aristotle so later centuries could borrow him intact, copyists spelling names correctly through earthquakes and rains. Gold ground to dust became harlows that inhaled low light. Lapis learned to hold an afternoon, even At vespers, carpenters bent wood into lecterns that spoke in the gentle grammar of boats, curves meant to carry weight without complaint. The Macedonian emperors would preside over what tidy labels call a renaissance, but its roots were here, faces restored to walls, letters taught to neighbours, the modest heroics of border farmers, the discipline of archives. And while the map pulsed, losing a province here, brightening a coastline there, the city's rhythm kept its pulse, processions stitching morning to evening, courts trying to keep the world from fraying, markets conducting their daily parliament of hands. If you were listening within such a market of hours, midnight in Toronto, dawn in Hanoi, a soft afternoon in Auckland, tell me where you are and what time has chosen you. There's comfort in knowing which latitudes our whisper finds. And if these unhurried passages feel like kind company, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so our nights keep meeting beneath the same patient sky. For somewhere, a coppersmith is tapping a border onto a chalice, meant to teach thirst about reverence. Somewhere a tax collector is leaving a widow enough coin for winter. Somewhere a child is sounding out the first syllables of a new alphabet, and discovering the sound already knows the shape of his mouth. Farther east, a crescent weather is gathering to test the empire's geometry again. But for now the lamps along the Meuse breathe evenly. The harbour rows its oars of moonlight, and the dome, remembering how to fold radiance, waits for morning like a bowl waits for bread. After seasons of argument thinned into mutual courtesy, a steadier brightness gathered, first like dawn edging a sill, then like noon accepted without surprise. Later hands would label it a renaissance, as if a city had slept and suddenly wakened. In truth, Constantinople had kept vigil through its rougher hours, and what the 9th and 10th centuries offered felt less like waking than like breathing more deeply. A new dynasty took the stage, Macedonian by tag, eclectic in blood, and under its long roof the empire practiced two crafts at once, the art of making beauty legible and the art of teaching frontiers patience. In palace libraries where lamp oil left a faint sweetness on sleeves, scribes coaxed brittle texts into clear copies. Philosophers argued politely with books that had walked across centuries to meet them. Court artists taught gold to behave like kept sunlight in psalters where prophets' robes seemed to move with a wind that understood reverence. Constantine VII, scholar emperor, considered the empire the way a craftsman fingers a beloved tool, often, carefully, with an affectionate desire to tune. He ordered manuals that read, like wise uncles counselling young princes, how to greet an envoy so that both prides return home intact, how to arrange a procession so theology and etiquette step in time, how to speak to tribes whose names travel like weather across the map, honouring their customs without misplacing your own. He wrote of ceremonies as gardeners write of seasons, what blooms when, and which pruning gives next year shade. Beyond those halls, the field armies rehearsed a simpler grammar of earth, hoof, bread, and steel. Generals trained mobility into habit. A column could loosen like a braid and be retied by dusk. Scouts taught officers to read horizons the way sailors read a swell. Against the disciplined Bulgars, the empire found in Basil II a patient metronome of war. He did not chase victories so much as wear them down, season by season, like a river remembering stone. His epithet survives with a wince. Bulgar Slayer, a name that invites compassion to step outside, but harsh titles often stand beside quieter truths, treaties where pride permitted, towns spared when surrender was prompt. The long arithmetic of borders aimed less at annihilation than at durable quiet. On hot afternoons, soldiers in felt caps mended sandals with sinew. On cold nights, They draped cloaks over mules, so the animals would not stiffen before dawn. Thus the edge was kept not only by stratagem, but by the modest pieties of maintenance. At sea, dromons kept their composure, oars taking counsel with waves, while lateen sails practiced their steep angles. Harbours smelled of tar, olives, and that particular expectation that gathers whenever a people understands that ships are part of its breath. Diplomats moved with a similar rhythm. The cases full of agreements that from a distance look like lace, marriages binding a northern prince to imperial kin, trade accords that taught furs, and wax to seek southern light, baptisms negotiated with a tact that let new faiths sit beside old loyalties without snapping them. One season, a Russ's embassy stood under the dome to measure its winter against a carried sky. Another season, a steppe ruler sent horses whose gaits were as smooth as court music and received silks that learned to live with snow. Within the city, craft acquired a serenity that did not preen. Ivory workshops set down combs and reliquaries whose curves felt like seashell recollections. Enamelers poured colour into copper cells until saints learned to shine with dusk's modesty. Mosaicists placed glass with a patience that could teach prayer to sit longer in its chair. A bronze smith who once hammered helms for men in a hurry now fashioned doors whose panels coached the hand in courtesy. Push here, pull there, reminding the passer that entry is a blessing. Bakers scored loaves so the crust sang when it broke. Mothers tied woven amulets to infants' wrists, the knots confidence borrowed from grandmothers. In the hippodrome, colour returned to its honest vocation. Spectacle, not spark. Blues and greens shouted as if the city possessed one throat with many timbres. Wages flooded, and a boy clutching a fig discovered he did not want to drive a chariot at all. He wanted to be the man who keeps the horses calm at the line, because calm was his gift. Court theatre delighted itself, but ceremony remained more than show. It taught the city its own step. Eunuchs, fluent in the grammar of thresholds, practiced the tact of those who know both intimacy and distance. Empresses moved, like arguments resolved. Patriarchs, even while debating Rome, across the tired bridge of words, kept homilies close to home. Arms before speculation, fasting before rhetoric. If schism widened, it did so like a river finding a secondary channel rather than like an axe. Most of it sounded less like doors slammed than like footnotes swelling into paragraphs over patient generations. Meanwhile the faithful knelt, choirs remembered their pitch, and incense climbed its quiet ladders, whether or not bishops agreed in Latin or Greek. In such weather, law learned to speak almost singingly. Codes were recopied and glossed. Judges trained their hearing, not only on the letter but on the human timbre behind it. A widow could press her seal and trust that the city's machinery would not grind her to powder. A merchant could lose a suit and still bless the day because his loss had been explained with honesty. Some afternoons Constantine traced with a finger the purple vines on a textile in his lap. Purple that understood restraint and thought of the empire in the same way, not a field to conquer, but a trellis to tend. Tied here, pruned there, trained toward light, without forcing what wood cannot yet bear. Even glory sours, if not salted with limits. Basil II died without a son, and succession, ancient tutor of humility, cleared its throat. New hands, competent but less patient, took the draft board with its pieces already in motion. To the east, Seljuk riders rehearsed a clipped grammar of speed. To the west, ambitions rippled through the Latin world with a heat that would one day curl maps and temper vows. In Anatolia, garrisons wondered if the hills had learned a new language. In the capital, Grain prices carried rumours in their arithmetic. Yet for a while the light held even, libraries stayed busy, and the harbour kept time like prayer. The city's confidence was neither naive nor grim. It had simply learned how to live with weather. If you tilt your ear to that age, you can still hear the choreography, oars keeping a promise with the Bosporus, court steps practiced until courtesy became muscle memory, a monk smiling when Gregory's vowels fell into their old friendship. Evening draws on its blue shawl, lamps answer one by one. Somewhere a general folds a map so the crease runs clean through an Anatolian pass, and somewhere a girl rolls gold leaf on bowl until it thins into breath. The dome holds a coin of dusk as a palm holds a bird, and far beyond the walls a horseman turns toward a road that will change the empire's sleep, not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon enough for the air to remember. The even light of Macedonian noon did not go out so much as grow thin by degrees, like silk worn smooth along a favoured sleeve, and in that soft wearing the empire showed both its polish and its phrase. Succession set the first quiet tremor. Basil's steady chair remembered too many different weights too quickly, and empresses with names like Fragrance, Zoe and Theodora held the purple with the steadiness learned in corridors where whispers are part of the furniture, while courtiers kept to their old choreography of deference and scribes spliced genealogies with the patience of gardeners. Michaels arrived, and another Michael, and a Constantine whose epithet shimmered between splendour and strain. Ceremonies shone so perfectly that sometimes they reflected more brilliance than power. In chancelleries, clever men, such as Celos, polished sentences like mirrors, faithful to language, a little misleading about the depth of the room. And coins still chimed from palm to dish, numismata, carrying the empire's face from market to monastery, though the music of money had slipped a note. Estates of the dinatoim lengthened like afternoon shadows, tax grain wandered home late, and the theme farmer, who once leaned a spear beside his plough as if it were only a sterner tool, now found both spear and claim pressed by neighbours with better papers and longer purses. Muster rolls along the frontier began to learn blanks. In their place came mercenaries of many weathers, the Varangians, tall as door frames and loyal as an oath kept to oneself, Norman blades that preferred decisions, steppe archers who read wind as easily as a priest reads psalms. Hired strength can be a good bridge in flood season and also a lesson in the price of crossings. Yet the city kept its liturgy of confidence. The hippodrome rehearsed colour. Hagia Sophia measured each day by the gate of light. Workshops coaxed small tendernesses into being, a clasp that taught two edges to meet without quarrel, an enamel saint who lowered his eyes to let the weary rest theirs. Diplomacy did as it always had here, braided threats into treaties, salted pride with courtesy, borrowed time from marriages whose rings connected snow rivers to olive coasts. Envoys met Pechenegs with maps and measured gifts, wrote to Cairo with a grammar that respected difference without yielding self, sent cool wine of words to rulers whose tents were moving towns. Still, the eastern horizon practiced its new language of dust and gallop, Seljuk riders, precise as birds, tasting passes and wells, teaching fortresses to listen for hooves that arrive like weather. Armenia, stone-scripted and mountain-shouldered, stood as buffer and argument, its princes slipping between oaths with the agility of those who survive by remembering more than one door out of a room. Cappadocia's tufa churches, rooms of ash turned prayer, watched caravans step carefully, while along the coasts the dromans kept their compact with the sea, oars and fire ready to finish each other's sentences if need pressed. In the courts, judgment still tried for civilized mercy, A widow pressed her seal into warm wax and felt the city hold her petition instead of letting it fall through cracks. A merchant lost a suit and went to vespers anyway, consoled by the thought that loss, properly explained, need not sour into grievance. Monasteries multiplied a quiet economy of salvation. Olive groves tended with more devotion than calculation. Granaries making winter gentler for villagers that gave alms in return. And yet sanctity, acquiring fields and rents, unwittingly drew grain from the soldier's pot. The old balance among swords stole, and stylus tilted, as deeds were written faster than borders could defend them, and blessings fell upon acres that once would have paid for watchmen on the ridge. Veterans taught recruits the old courtesies, how to lace a greave so it would not bite on the second day of March, how to share a water skin without insult, even as their stories turned toward garrisons that came late, pay that came later, and orders obliged to cross mountains that maps made look kinder than they are. Beauty persisted the way certain plants persist in courtyards, by learning the exact terms of shade. A mosaicist in the coppersmith's quarter found a blue so obedient to dusk that saints seemed to breathe beneath it. In the Magnora, a young scholar read Aristotle until syllables felt like hinges, swinging open rooms of sense he had not known were in his own house. A nurse in Blanchenois discovered that honey with time can persuade a cough to change its mind. The city's soul was not failing. It was simply adjusting to a gait that secures long memory at the cost of quick sprint. And while bishops and legates, speaking across the tired bridge between Rome's Latin and Constantinople's Greek, let footnotes swell into paragraphs and paragraphs into a parting, later named schism, parish doors kept learning the same old lessons: how to close softly, how to open wide. The emperor of a certain year, Romanos by baptism, Diogenes by trial, looked east and read ridgelines like a man taught that maps are not promises but questions. He drilled braided pride with pragmatism, and trusted where he must, in captains whose accents did not always agree, in units that shook themselves into cohesion only after the first volley. Dust lifted along the Armenian roads and settled into cloak hems. In way station courtyards, officers bent over figs and hard cheese, knives pointing at sketched hills, while the afternoon warmed and the air, mild and incurious, listened. Village ovens cooled early so men could march. Mothers tied charms. Grandmothers whispered recipes for stamina disguised as soup. A scribe copying enlistments paused at a name he once knew as a boy, let the pen rest, then rode on. To the west, tidings came in another timbre. Norman appetites along old Roman shores, negotiations done with a knife. Phoenician merchants walking as if measuring rooms for future furniture. Embers laid aside in the mind's careful hearth. Stand on the sea walls in that season, and you could hear lullaby and warning braided in one breeze. Gulls diagramming diplomacy with lines and arcs, oars keeping tempo in the horn, a horse stamping where a saddle has just been inspected for the third time. The dome held its coin of moon, as if weighing silver before purchase. The Maze remembered how to empty quickly when the whisper of campaign spread. Palace lamps, in rows that made their own discreet constellation, burned with the composure of people who have seen many midnights and do not dramatize them. Far out on the Anatolian plateau, a salt plain wore the sunset like mail. Beyond it, tents, pale punctuation marks, rested in clauses of grass, and fires wrote their short, bright arguments against the dark. Seasoned and still proud, the empire stepped toward a meeting it did not imagine decisive. Meetings rarely announced themselves. There were saddles to check, blessings to speak, scouts to thank, a letter to reassure a city that knows both courage and caution. And somewhere on a wooden table, a map received a careless ring of wine, the kind of circle a monk will trace years later with a finger, wondering whether that stain marks the quiet place where fortune turned its page. The summer road eastward lifted its usual dust, and in that dust walked intentions, the sort that sound decisive across a table of maps and grow shy once the hills begin to speak. Columns stretched and tightened as they climbed into the high light of Anatolia. Standards leaned in the afternoon wind like disciplined wheat. The Varangians carried their axes with that unhurried sureness born of vows to themselves, while lighter bows belonged to men whose clipped syllables kept the cadence of the step. The emperor of that season set his camp by an old fortress with a name like basalt in the mouth, Manzikert, while scouts traced circles through the scrub and returned with reports that changed their colour by the hour. The Seljuk host behaved like weather, a dark band on a ridge, then a handful of horsemen riding cursive in dust, always arriving as rumour one heartbeat before the eye could swear it true. Their sultan, fluent in the grammar of space, preferred commas to periods, feints, retreats that were not, arrows launched like well-aimed opinions, and then withdrawn into the margin. Morning came with ceremonial calm, as mornings do when men have, for now, decided who they will be. Lines dressed themselves, blessings moved down the ranks like bread. A careful ration of courage was issued with the same restraint one uses for water. The plan, drawn in sober ink, required steadiness. Hold, advance in measured teeth, refuse the temptation to chase riders who could turn ground into suggestion. For a while the plan held. Dust rose and softened edges. Shields made a sensible wall. The first cloud of arrows broke like rain on tile. Then the day performed its old trick of turning maps into literature. Units separated and re-knit without elegance. Messages lagged behind horses. A wing that expected a partner found a grammatical gap where a clause should have stood. The reserve at the rear watched with that taut awareness that knows it may be asked to become the sentence that saves the page. In the emperor's pavilion, the cups sat where servants had set them, a still life, awaiting a painter no one had summoned. Somewhere in the long afternoon, a rumour made itself useful to fate. An order for withdrawal in good order read as retreat. A reserve commanded by a man whose name sounded like paperwork turned his back when his face was wanted. Later, scholars would quarrel over motive, misreading or malice, prudence or treason, the dry calculus of factions rehearsing tomorrow. But men on the field had no leisure to grade intentions. They saw only the loosening at the margins, and into those seams rode horses trained to find seams. Circles tightened. Arrows arrived and arrived again. The sun, impartial and eloquent, lowered its judgment over flags that began to look like flowers gone thin. The emperor fought as if arguing the day back into reason. Wounded, surrounded, he was taken, dusty, proud, into a tent that kept evenings cool. Across a carpet, like a measured sea, two men sat and treated history as if it were a neighbour. The Seljuk Sultan, courteous, salted by victory. The captive, who had not mislaid his habit of command. It is told the Sultan pressed a foot upon his fallen rival's neck, then lifted him by the hand, gesture terrible, then almost tender, reminding the world that theatre is one of war's dialects. Terms were spoken, money, fortresses, the courtesy of release. Outside, under a sky already forgiving the day its rhetoric, men looked for water and for friends who did not answer, for horses that knew only the alphabet of panic. Armour scatter, Empires more slowly do. The defeat was no ending by itself, no single battle prize a millennium from its hinge, but it removed a keystone from an arch grown complacent with its own weight. Anatolia, granary and nursery, barracks and school, began to unbutton its loyalties. Pastures learned new languages. Markets tried lighter coins with unfamiliar prayers. Families who once measured distance by how long a psalm takes to steep, now measured by how far a cart could go before arrows frayed the morning. The themes, those patient marriages of soil and spear, slackened like old rope. Landlords lengthened their shade. Monasteries fed more mouths while counting fewer rents. In the capital, the palace exercised its other mastery. The quick revision of narrative. Arrival was crowned with a haste that sounded like relief. The captive emperor, released on terms that presumed charity at home, met the cold arithmetic of men who preferred not to remember. Blinding stood in as punctuation, a period set to end a sentence the city did not wish to hear, yet beside loss the old machinery steadied. Harbours kept their tide-taught work. Courts judged fish and dowry with the same careful ears. In Hagia Sophia the chant did not falter, because chant is a sovereignty that admits no usurpation. Craftsmen comforted a world with reliquaries and locks, buckles and censers, objects whose modest excellence taught hands to remember gentleness. Mothers rehearsed soups that persuade weakness to eat. Scribes, though their ink felt heavier, copied homilies with fidelity that refused despair. Night watchmen touched iron like sailors touch a mast, an oath with metal. The empire had been cut. It would not consent to bleed to death. To the west, new weather gathered over Latin Christendom, devout heat shouldering itinerant vows. To the south, Venice measured coin against horizon. To the north, the Russes baptized winters into something less absolute. Inside the walls, professionals of patience began their repairs in another key. A family named Comnenus walked the palace gardens with the calm of those who study broken hinges and already know a smith. In their pockets lay small plans that do not rattle. One evening, a boy on the seawall traced the line of silver water with a salt-wet finger, while his grandfather told a story that acknowledged the wound but refused it, the last word. Lamps came on, discreet as conscience. Somewhere a general folded a map until the crease no longer slid a fatal pass. Somewhere a monk pared a quill to a gentler point. The dome gathered dusk until it shone like a held breath. And beyond the hills that had learned a new hoofbeat, a caravan threaded a pass with patient syllables, linen, spice, rumour, bringing toward the city a pair of twins, wrapped in the same cloth. Trouble and opportunity, both knocking for admission at the same gate. It was a family, not a miracle, that steadied the room after the floor had tilted, and the man who walked first among them, lean with the habit of marching, dry-eyed from long practice in choosing, learned to listen to trouble, as a physician listens to a chest, not frightened by the noise, attentive to the pattern beneath. He found a treasury thinner than the candlesticks implied, barracks underpaid, frontiers like hems frayed by too many doorways. So he did what households do when they mean to last. He sorted, mended, reprioritized. He paid soldiers first in promises, then in grain, then, when grain remembered its value, in coin. He stitched alliances where cloth had parted. He turned toward the sea, with the humility of a land commander who knows water, not land, is a city's breath. Normans, restless as summer thunder, tested the western coasts and were answered not by boasting, but by preparation. Pechenegs, certain as weather, learned that walls can adopt new habits when men decide to stand, and in the palace, competence quietly outranked ceremony, which is rarer than it sounds. In chancelleries, the ink remembered decisiveness. In workshops, the bowyer's fingers relearned patience. And in monasteries' barns practiced generosity without vanity. Across the great peninsula, with its severe clarifying light, riders in narrow stirrups wrote dust letters spelling the name of a power now seated along old imperial roads. He did not pretend they would vanish, but learned instead when to face and when to angle, how to buy pauses with concessions that felt temporary and therefore livable. Then news came with a different flavour, iron speaking piety, vows hammered into swords. To the west, a sermon had loosened a continent, and men who had met maps only as rumour walked towards sunrise, bearing cross-shaped weather on their backs. The emperor read the double edge at once, help that sounded like zeal and calculated like appetite. He invited it carefully, like fire to a cold hearth. Envoys wrapped instructions in courtesy. The city prepared reception halls where protocol could teach emotion to keep its shoes clean. First came the many, hopeful, hungry, so guards learned to count bread as diplomacy, market women hid their best produce, and then conscience tugged, brought it out again. Clergy rehearsed blessings that were also boundaries. After them came princes, banners ordered, beasts bright on silk. Oaths were taken as if words could be mortared into walls. At night he measured those oaths against sturdier bricks called interest and thought. Not for the first time, how survival is the art of making alliances that later complain about how they were made. He ferried them across the Bosporus like a careful host, guiding guests to a neighbouring room. Welcome, yes, but not to camp in the parlour, and required what could be required. Taken cities returned, victories remembering whose house had set the table. Some promises held, others frayed. Hands tire where the world is stitched. Out there, in towns once Roman in law, and now renamed by many tongues, Latin banners learned to stand in eastern winds. Antioch, and then Jerusalem's, became sentences Europe repeated to itself until legend smoothed their edges. Here at the Straits the account kept subtler grammar. Caravans again chose roads ending at the Golden Horn. Tribute and trade made cautious visits. Garrisons slept less anxiously beneath blankets thicker by a finger's width. In the court, a daughter with a mind like polished onyx set her ink to history and to the anatomy of power, watching men assemble policies out of memory and imagining future readers who would need a lantern for those corridors. In the barracks, reforms took names that sounded like verbs: pronoia, revenue traded for service, part payment plan, part social contract, part confession that centres must lean on provinces without pretending otherwise. The fleet, scolded back to discipline, remembered its manners. Dromons folded wind into obedience. Arsenals counted stores until numbers settled into a serenity that permits sleep. In the hippodrome, colour returned to pastime rather than politics. On feast days, the city performed its old miracle of making strangers feel for an hour like citizens. Each remedy carried its reminder. Italians, Venetians most of all, received charters that opened doors wider than some would later admit. Privileges minted in rooms where need spoke louder than prudence made future bargaining noisy. Warehouses along the Horn acquired accents that did not ask permission to set prices. North winds brought rumours of Franks discovering that pilgrim roads double as markets and markets tempt ships to behave like arguments. The emperor, and then his son, walked these compromises like a narrow quay in winter, steady, eyes forward, knowing one does not build a city of domes by being squeamish. To the east, Seljuk Beyliks learned the art of being plural and patient, testing valleys and then taxing them, which is conquest in a durable key. To the west, Norman appetites did what they do, spoke quickly, took possession, and left clerks to make the speech polite afterward. Between those weathers the capital kept its poised breath. Inside the walls, the daily mercies continued their schooling. A midwife in Samarthia washed hands with vinegar and hymn before entering a room where a cry braided itself to life. A jurist wrote a judgment that turned two enemies back into neighbours. A boy in the tanner's quarter learned to tell, by scent alone, the difference between patience and neglect. A deacon practiced the precise swing of a censer, so smoke learned to speak without haste. On the Maisie, beggars perfected the ethics of good positions, how to share a corner, how to reserve a patch of shade for the older man whose cough carried a story. Light entered Hagia Sophia with its old tact, touching porphyry, then withdrawing a breath so as not to overwhelm. The choir remembered a mode that acts on the blood, like reassurance. If the maps were troubled at the edges, the interior life was confident without being loud, which is a rarer victory than Chronicle's record. There were frames too, hung like small icons for memory. An emperor, older now, steadying his palm against a column cool from mourning. A princess pausing over a sentence until it confessed both truth and kindness. A Varangian guard, foreign and faithful, carving a few runes into marble as if to say, I was here, I was loyal. I listened to this city breathe. One winter evening, snow visited with uncommon patience and lay along the land walls like a gentle hand. Lanterns along the harbour drew modest halos. Somewhere a merchant added, with honest pleasure, a third olive to the stew because business had been kind. The empire was not cured of danger. It had merely remembered how to be convalescent with dignity. And far away, in counting houses where Latin pens clicked like small beetles, another arithmetic began to dream of dues and debts, of fleets obedient to profit before piety, of a crusade that might accept a detour if wealth pointed the way. But for tonight the sea keeps its pewter vow, the walls recite their lesson from memory, and the dome catches the moon like a coin placed carefully in a dish, an offering, a reminder, and the beginning of a question the next century will try to answer. In the years when recovery learned to dress itself as confidence, the empire put on a brighter cloak, silk-lined, well-mended, smelling faintly of incense and brine, and beneath that fabric a careful musculature kept time. Ships counted and recounted, treaties rehearsed until they moved like muscle memory. Coins struck with a face that still believed it could persuade. A tall emperor with sunny appetites, Manuel, whose thoughts rode out gladly to meet the Latin world, taught the court a quicker step. Jousts flashed in palace courtyards like imported weather. Embassies multiplied their bows until a single morning felt woven from salutations. He courted kings west of the Adriatic, not as supplicant but as choreographer, braiding blue-eyed winters to Aegean light through marriages that promised a wider horizon, and he tested fortunes in Italy, as if asking whether ancient Roman stones might still recognise a Greek footfall. Along the Golden Horn, Venetian and Genoese counting rooms climbed like vigorous vines. Privileges, granted in thin minutes when the treasury needed breath, hardened into habits that were shy to unlearn. Bales of wool and pepper sailed under foreign flags while local merchants lowered their voices, and the harbour's old music, ropes, gulls, hammers, discovered itself underscored by abacus clicks in accents that had no plans to apologise. Even so, the city's poise held. Manuel's armies, a mosaic of names and loyalties, could still look like purpose when their banners rose together. He loved spectacle but understood preparation. Arsenals kept their quiet inventories, and the Varangians, who thought of the palace as an adopted cliff stood with the uncomplicated ferocity of men loyal first to oaths. Yet, out on the Anatolian plateau, where wind keeps its own counsel, a campaign studded at Myriokephalon, and the passers remembered their old trick of turning columns into scattered punctuation. It was not Manzikert again, but it spoke the same dialect of caution. Repair the forts, choose the roads with humility, read maps as questions. He returned to a city still shining, and the city, generous as mothers are to sons who come home proud and dusted, received him with lamps and music. Somewhere in a ledger, a clerk added a figure with a frown, and somewhere on a threshold, a veteran leaned his spear and looked past the middle distance. After him, the stage filled with quicker shadows. Andronikos, charm like a warming glove that hid the palm, promised moral spring, pruning corrupt branches, disciplining hands that had learned to count too greedily. For a season the city believed. He punished elegantly and spoke as if justice were an old friend returning. Then the glove tightened. Fear began to file what law should have shaped. Streets learned to listen before breathing. And when Constantinople's long patience with humiliation finally snapped, a murderous day when Latin merchants paid in blood for a century of privilege, the air filled with a bitterness that knew it was not wisdom. The bridge between worlds shook. Those who had walked it blithely began to look down. Andronikos fell, as such men fall, sudden, terrible, to a crowd that needed proof of mourning. In the stunned quiet, a prince was fetched from a hunt and crowned with the look of a man handed a complicated instrument and told to play something soothing at once. Isaac arrived with good intentions and poor arithmetic. Debts, Venetian above all, moved through chambers like tide. Tax farmers sharpened quills until villagers felt the pressure as a new climate. In the barracks, promises took on the thin-toned soldiers recognize and despise. A blind cousin grasped the throne in a co so tidy it felt bureaucratic. Alexios III loved glitter and hired competence late. Near the docks, men with long memories noticed foreign warehouses untroubled, while local stalls paid twice. In monasteries, abbots counted grain and chose which alms could still be given without lying to hunger. Hagia Sophia continued to tutor light in mercy, but even mercy reflected a smaller city. Fewer candles, leaner purses, a choir that sang bravely, while the sacristan counted wicks. Far to the west, vows tangled with balance sheets and began to dream toward the Bosporus. A crusade was preached again. Men with little land and enough credit boarded an idea whose captain wore the horns of commerce. Venice, old, salt-wise, agreed to ferry an army larger than the promise that summoned it. And when pilgrims could not pay, the arithmetic of piety discovered the talent for detour. Zara, Christian and inconvenient, learned what debt does to theology. Into that ambiguity stepped a youth with an imperial name and a desperate proposal, Alexios Angelos, offering gold, soldiers, and obedience to Rome if the Latins would set him again upon Byzantium's chair. Words light in his mouth, heavy in their consequence, sailed winter seas to counting houses where wind is diligently converted to coin. Rumours reached the capital like travellers in cloaks. Some scoffed. The walls had taught crusaders humility before. The chain across the horn was not a metaphor, but iron. Others, knowing hunger alters grammar, read the city's anxieties as a ledger. Debts west, rivals within, thin affection in the streets, an army that could still stand, but perhaps not long. A few warned that inviting Latin aid is like lending your best room to a guest who forgets the house is not his. Is not. Still, hope drafted a careful bargain. Pay later. Promise union in the abstract. waved from the ramparts with courtesy enough to turn ambition into escort duty. Spring sharpened, sails multiplied until the water looked stitched, lions and saints in gilt, approached with the composure of people convinced their cause travelled with outriders in heaven. The first arrival felt like rehearsal. Envoys in mail with hands too clean of dust, a letter declaimed in the square like a riddle that knows its answer. Crowds gathered, proud and curious. The Varangians shifted their weight in the gates. The emperor, uneasy, inside a robe that had ceased to console, counted allies and found some had mislaid their courage. On the horn, the chain lay like a sleeping serpent. In the church's icons watched with that grave tenderness that refuses melodrama. Night drew its cool cloth over roofs and quarrels alike. Somewhere a bookbinder pressed a spine until it held. Somewhere a baker set aside one last loaf for a widow who pays with blessing. And out beyond the straits' mouths, a forest moved, masts and vows, hunger and hymn, towing toward the city not only soldiers and trumpets and painted saints, but ledgers, contracts, grievances, and that particular curiosity that tests another's latch without asking. The moon looked at the chain. The chain regarded the moon, and the water, breathing evenly as ever, kept its calm face while far off a ship's bell decided, quietly, to speak. Dawn braided the water with masts, and the city, so practised at greeting the world, felt a different pressure in its chest, the way a household does when guests arrive with flowers in one hand and ledgers in the other. The fleet waited with the calm of a choice already made, high castles painted, lions and saints bright on cloth, hymns and iron riding the same breeze. On the sea walls, Varangians kept that particular attention that looks like stillness. Along the horn, the great chain lay quiet but awake. Messages slid like beads through practiced fingers, proposals, counters, numbers that rose and fell with the hour's weather. A pale, displaced prince promised debts paid and doors opened. Envoys returned, phrases polished by habit. Restore the father, unite the churches, fill the coffers, and the fleet will turn from threat to escort. In marble rooms, where whispers linger, the emperor counted friends and found subtraction working faster than addition. In alleys, where fishmongers mined their own arithmetic, mutters thickened with the salt of old grievances. Over everything drifted that bright western certainty, the serene handshake between right and profit. The first trial was iron against water. Galleys tested the chain and learned exactly what iron says when spoken to roughly. It held with the dignity of a monosyllable, but pressure, once invited, invents. Holes found purchase where towers had grown complacent. Ladders attempted manners with stone. Shouts traded languages without losing meaning. And on the landward side, the Theodosian walls, teachers of humility to generations, faced banners advancing as if repetition could make a map become a door. Haste braided into ceremony. An emperor slipped away like a thought he could no longer defend. A blinded predecessor was recalled in tragic courtesy. The younger Alexios, who had promised oceans, was crowned beside his restored father, wearing a face that tried to memorize confidence like declensions. Lamps were lit. The city, practical as ever, tried to believe the disturbance might end with receipts and blessings. But money obeys weathers, not wishes. The treasuries proved long on echo, short on coin. Sainted halos were melted to pour silver into foreign hands. The city was squeezed until kindness winced. Venice presented the bill with gracious firmness. Soldiers, told that patience should behave like piety, asked to be paid in the grammar they understood. Pitch found a reason. Quayside quarrels grew teeth. Night cracked with glass. Fire came, a teacher uninvited. Running roofs like heated rumour. lifting galleries into brief red speech and unseeming neighbourhoods that had tolerated difference. Mourning laid grey in the seams of stone, grief remembered whom to blame. Bargains frayed. Latin officers, impatient with delays named treachery, studied the walls with fresher affection. Princes rehearsed reasons. Debtors rehearsed apologies. The young emperor, more ink than experience, learned how decisions can sail. In the corridors, intrigue counted quicker. Another Alexios, fifth by annal, first by audacity, moved with the cool of a man who prefers answers to questions. A coup travelled like a sudden draught through a shut room. The co-emperors were tidied from the stage, and the city recognised, with a weariness older than bells, that it was negotiating not only with arrivals but with itself. The fleet's posture shifted. No longer escorts awaiting payment, but creditors practising repossession. April's Light, famous for honesty, watched as towers along the Horn faced a new craft. Ships lashed into floating walls. Scaling bridges hinged like careful jaws. The chain, proud, proven, was lifted aside by men who know symbols have hinges. Assaults that had broken like waves learned the carpenter's precision. Varangian axes bit ladders into regret. Bowstrings sang. A priest on the parapet blessed men who could not hear him over the grammar of wood and iron. A standard clung to a parapet like a brave mistake, then another, then a press of bodies that favoured assent over explanation. A gate became a hall, the hall a street, the city's long, unwilling sentence. What followed is hard to tell without the voice trembling. Soldiers, brave, young, owed, afraid, entered rooms meant for sacrament and ceremony and took what armies take when cities break, plate and coin, cloth and relic, even time, pried loose him from bronzes and marbles. The great church suffered indignities. Ink still chooses gently, beasts where beasts do not belong, a drunken stagger song on holy floor, an altar touched by hands that did not know how to hold. The bronze horses, patient witnesses to centuries, were led toward another sea to shine elsewhere, as beauty does, leaving behind the ache of a voice heard through a wall. Chroniclers wrote with bitterness, with tears, with surgeons cool. All knew a hinge had slipped. Yet, even in breaking, the city kept its older habits. A monk tucked a manuscript behind a loose stone and patted it to sleep. A woman guided two neighbours to assist, and she trusted and waited, while the noise above behaved like weather. An old official pressed a small amulet into a guardsman's palm because courtesy seeks work even in ruin. When lions and keys and red crosses hung where eagles and Christograms had kept company, an age closed, not with the door's click, but with breath leaving an instrument. The empire did not end. It divided into rooms that still remembered the house. In Nicaea, shoulders straightened and continuity took a desk. In Epirus, pride stocked its pantry. In Trebizond, a lineage claimed a balcony over the Black Sea. Constantinople learned to sleep beneath a foreign ceiling, to speak rent in a new accent, to keep deep in drawers the photographs of who it had been. Night returned more tenderly than anyone deserved. Fires lowered their voices. The horn traded flame for moon. In a workshop where someone had latched the door, a single icon, spared by accident or gentle hands, watched the dust settle. Along the land walls, spring grass practiced patience between stones. A soldier from the north traced a carved cross with a blunt finger, not reading, only feeling its stubbornness. Far off, in Nicaea, a lamp was lit, and a clean book opened to its first page. And very late, a small fishing boat, indifferent to flags, set its net in the dark water, letting the city's broken light lie on the ripples like scattered coins that one day might be gathered again. After the bright breakage, continuity moved into smaller rooms, and in Nicaea a table was cleared, a seal pressed, and a thin, durable government learned to speak in the plural again, emperors in exile with a capital of tiled roofs and orchards instead of porphyry and bronze. Their rescue was almost domestic in its wisdom. Fields were counted like careful coins, bee yards encouraged, silkworms coaxed through narrow winters, law recopied until its memory stopped trembling. Theodore, first to wear purple far from the sea walls he loved, taught his court to prefer competence over nostalgia. His successors, gentler in tone but firmer in ledger, schooled armories to think in years rather than afternoons. Monasteries behaved like double granaries, of spirit and of grain. A novice learned to bind books as if suturing a wound. A prior walked the orchard, teaching trees to ignore headlines. In Epirus, cousins rehearsed sovereignty with a mountain's pride. In Trebizond, the sea poured its patience into a narrow throne that greeted wind and merchants with equal courtesy. Couriers crossed valleys with packets of ink and hope, and the idea of empire, lighter now and more portable, travelled in satchels and in the mouths of men who could pronounce continuity without sounding vain. Diplomacy resumed its housekeeping. Letters to Bulgarian courts salted with respect, to Seljuk beys, offers in the grammar of coexistence, to Italian communes, charters that tried to keep profit from hardening into jurisdiction. Along the Meander and Hermus the earth worked without ideology, wheat arguing with weeds, vines learning discipline, ditches performing their civic duty. A widow in Magnesia found new officials kept promises with a clerk's stubbornness. A smith near Sardis discovered that a tax on charcoal, properly explained, felt almost like a contribution. The army, lean, stitched from loyalties that survived embarrassment, moved as if in borrowed boots, cautious but resolved. Fortresses, small and unromantic, were repaired with unshowy love. Gatehouses relearned the difference between welcome and access. Storehouses rotated sacks so the weevils did less harm. In schools, boys copied Homer beside Basil and the Psalms. One, catching a beam of light across the page, felt sure for a moment that beauty had decided to rejoin the world. Across the straits, Constantinople practiced the complicated art of living beneath a crown that did not match the ring. Latin lords set tables with knives in the wrong places. Markets wore accents that taxed patience as well as goods. Yet, even under banners from distant cathedrals, the city kept small fidelities. A Greek baker crossed his loaves. A gardener at Blakeney watered a vine planted before the sack. The stones themselves, slow of appetite, refused to forget the weight of old processions. Word travelled that the bronze horses stared now at a different square's sky. Mothers told children the animals would one day remember the rhythm of their hooves. In Nicaea, a scholar named his hope without blush, not survival, return. His emperor, John, who kept 2 ledgers, grain and honour, sent gifts that were arguments and armies that were metaphors made of iron. "We are coming," they said softly, as one wakes a house. Genoa and Venice, arithmetic's patient tutors, listened from counting houses. One offered ships to the exile, the other guarded the city like a creditor guards collateral. Treaties were signed whose clauses read like weather maps: winds, rights, docks, dues. The exiles chose a friend for an hour longer than prudence advised and found the hour enough. Scouts watched the Horn with fishermen's eyes. In summer of a year that would later fit neatly into margins, a modest column under Strategopoulos, who preferred results to heraldry, slipped to the land walls and discovered, by a kindness of the moon, that certain gates had forgotten their shyness. The city was not empty, only distracted. A bar lifted, a street accepted the footsteps it had missed. And when the first Greek voices sounded in old corridors, the walls answered like instruments kept dry too long and astonished to be tuned again. Homecoming was not triumph. It was convalescence. Michael, eighth by number, Palaiologos by patience, entered not a jewel box restored, but a shell that remembered music. He kissed stone, set guards, wrote letters announcing what his feet already knew. The empire had found its chair, but the upholstery was thin and the springs tired. He summoned artisans, not poets, lime to wash scars, masons to teach archers how to carry themselves again, iconographers to let faces rise from plaster with the hesitancy of the newly wakened. In the Chora, a patron with a forehead full of thought, metachites in love with numbers, stars and charity, would one day give mosaics that looked like light practicing its scales, a mother instructing her child in the art of being both mortal and luminous, saints whose skin remembered dusk. In libraries, minuscule walked with confidence, philosophers argued with Aristotle like a neighbour at the gate, poets found in modest measures a rest from rhetoric. Costs, though, tallied themselves. The treasury, ransomed and re-ransomed, learned the grammar of apology, Italian privilege, minted earlier and not easily revised, set up shop at the city's lungs. Customs houses learned Ligurian. Harbours handled more contracts than convictions. In Anatolia, where strength once rose like bread each morning, Turkish bailiks multiplied with the pragmatic patience of people who could keep both horse and promise. Towns that tithed to bishops began to tithe to Timariots, who prayed in another cadence. Court life, spare but graceful, practiced a theatre of consolation. Ceremonies, scaled to slender means, purple content with honest dye. Yet a brightness returned that was not show. Icons, with eyes the colour of forgiveness. Hymns that coaxed grief into singable intervals. Hesychasts in mountain cloisters, teaching breath to sit with the name until the heart remembered its quiet work. Some remedies brought fevers of their own. To hire Catalan steel against Turks was to invite a weather that forgets whose fields it waters. The company fought efficiently and then, like fire, explored the pleasure of spreading. Lawsuits learned new names for old wounds. Abbots counted olives and wondered what price safety should bear. In council, a party of union with Rome asked theology to carry diplomacy. Another, with 1204 still in its bones, warned that a syllable too many could tear a fabric no hand could mend. The emperor listened like a man hearing doctors whose medicines disagree. He smiled less, slept thin, and walked the terraces at dusk, reading a difficult text by failing light. Still, afternoons arrived when the city forgot arithmetic. Sun-laid coins on the Bosporus, children chased each other beneath restored porticos. A scribe blew on a finished page and felt the old gratitude that ink dries. In Hagia Sophia, a re-gilded patch of plaster caught a beam and tossed it back like a restored word. A widow bought figs without counting days and ate one slowly in the shade, thinking of nothing except sweetness. The land walls, scarred, stitched, enduring. Let swallows write their tiny curved sentences. Down at the docks, a sailor from Chios ran a hand along newly corked planks and said to no one that this city still knows the difference between repair and illusion. Evening drew on. In that Byzantium blue, painters remember better than meteorologists. Lamps rose like modest stars. On the mesa, a blind musician found the old key, and a thin, attentive crowd breathed together. Far away, beyond a plateau taught new prayers, a forge hammered a horseshoe for a rider who would inherit another crescent. Nearer, in a scholar's house, a boy copied the spheres and felt for an instant that order might be persuaded to stay. The dome held its fraction of moonlight like a coin in a careful palm, and in the barracks a captain rolled a map until the crease ran through a narrow strait to the north, and said very quietly that a new power had noticed its reflection there, a prelude to a colder wind that would soon ask the city to read another difficult sentence aloud. The new century entered like a considerate guest, laying down its cloak before speaking, and those who listened with the city's old patience heard a changed cadence on the stair, a rhythm gathering from the northwest, where a young house of crescent and discipline learned to walk with an uncommon economical balance. In palaces that had remembered the virtue of modesty, emperors with familiar names, Andronikos, then another Andronikos, and at last a grandson, who inherited his grandsire's sharpness without his seasons, argued their kinship into knots, as if loyalty could be retied by patience alone. While those loops narrowed the corridors at home, the map outside lengthened its sentences. Osmond's campfires as first punctuation, Orhan's crossings as the next clause, and then Gallipoli, unlatched by an earthquake shrug in 1354, opening a door no rhetoric could shut. At first the city felt it as weather, a cooler wind across the straits, a rumour of horsemen who kept their prayers and marches in the same unshowy time. Bells continued their sober errands, but in Thracian villages the ground rehearsed hooves, as if preparing for a lasting guest. Even so, Constantinople answered calamity with its old counterpoint of liturgy and craft. In the Cora, light learned a finer grammar across Tesserae, where Christ and his mother stood, like dawn paused, at the lip of day. On mountain heights the hesychasts taught the breath to sit with the name, until silence brightened, in councils smelling faintly of ink and thunder. Gregory Palamis's sentences found a house tender enough to keep them. In lanes, a baker still crossed his loaves. In courts, a judge walked the long way through quarrel to its human centre. In a scriptorium of kind light a monk stitched Aristotle to Basil, so future minds would not be forced to choose between clarity and consolation. Yet the ledger noticed what beauty prefers to overlook. At Galata, the Genoese counted dues with saltwise calm. Privileges signed on thin afternoons thickened into stubborn habit. Custom houses acquired Ligurian phrases, and down narrow ways a black ship coughed the word plague, setting a second moonless tide to walking the stones. Cupboards thinned, psalms grew hoarse, and still the city adjusted its gait and kept going. A boy became soldier and then emperor, Andronikos III, whose stride matched the times with welcome seriousness. He mended where mending would hold, pressed coin where coin would consent, breathed life toward the fleet, treated borders like rooms that might be made livable with broom and lock. But air was thin, and strivings aged quickly. After him, civil quarrels returned like an old ache. John Kantakouzenos and the Regency circling by patience and steel, banners facing banners within sight of familiar domes, cousins recast as counters on a board, rubbed smooth by earlier games, while the Ottomans, pragmatic as weather, harvested consequence. Maritza in 1371, where night and river aided their grammar, then Kosovo's long shadow, town by town the polite etiquette of submission, folding governors into vassals without breaking the furniture, and in the west a bright-sleeved chivalry at Nicopolis learned beneath a remorseless sun that vows are not armour. Still the city breathed, still the sea made lungs for it, and on certain mornings the Golden Horn wore silver that made strangers soften their shoulders. Grace arrived from dry distances. Tamerlane's wind at Ankara in 1402 cracked the Ottoman anvil and scattered princes into lanes of rivalry. The empire used that hour as a housewife uses lucid dawn, patching, bargaining, tightening the cord that keeps the day together. Manuel II, scholar and pilgrim, walked Europe with a patience that did not humiliate, speaking a rhetoric of survival that turned pity into coin and coin into mortar, and at night in foreign rooms he wrote of faith and reason like a man setting the table straight after guests have left. At home the walls were made orderly, lime-hauled, crenels squared, fewer Varangians cut fewer runes, but local watches drilled with austerity that felt like virtue. Candles in Hagia Sophia learned to last longer by being well trimmed. When the Crescent House recovered from its quarrel and found again a sober strength in Murad and Mehmed, the capital ventured another embassy, this time to its estranged brother. At Ferrara, then Florence, beneath frescoes from a sunnier confidence, bishops and emperors raised signatures like bridges over gulfs words had dug. The union, so necessary, ran like a narrow aqueduct, beautiful in concept, perilous in practice. In the nave at home, some heard Rome's syllables as rescue, others as a draught that chills the tenderest room. Priests were patient, dock workers plain-spoken, grandmothers measured doctrine against the way soup feeds grief. Ink dried, roofs did not immediately steady, and yet a thread of hope remained, looped through the needle's eye. Meanwhile, art kept a kinder ledger. Painters laid a blue, remembering dawn and bruise at once. Carvers gave doors a tact that steadied hands before entry. Chanters mapped mercy across phrases, so even the poor felt included in a beauty they could not buy. Grass worked its slow green grammar into joints of stone along the land walls. In the harbours, a modest forest of masts moved at its own honest pace. A widow bought 2 figs, one for memory and one for now. A magistrate found an old decree in a drawer and smiled to see how law sometimes keeps the handwriting of the just. Evening raised lamps like small planets along the Mese, and for a moment survival sounded less like a tactic than a music. But beyond the Hellespont, new voices tested the air, cannon learning their arguments, powder, modern theologian, debating stone, and a young prince tracing with Euclid's finger the straightest line between appetite and wall. The city, old in listening, received these rehearsals without panic, tightened belts, mended parapets, tuned psalms, sent letters that tried to persuade weather with courtesy. Night folded itself over the domes. The moon balanced like a patient teacher on Hagia Sophia's shallow curve. In a courtyard, a boy learned the weight of a shield and was surprised to feel pride instead of despair. In Edirne, a map was smoothed and a ruler set upon it like a promise. Nearer at hand, a glazier replaced a small pane, so morning would have a clear way in. And in that gentle hinge between hours, the city, scarred, faithful, exact in its courtesies, drew breath as if preparing at last to answer a question not yet spoken aloud. Winter stepped aside after its patient rehearsals, and along the straits a new exactness took the stage, angular, tireless, the sort that measures distance with rope and appetite with iron. Across the water, where hills keep a sterner patience, a young sovereign drew straight lines as other men draw prayers. From rock he raised conclusions in stone, and on the European bank a fortress shouldered itself into the Bosporus's vocabulary. Rumeli, Hizar, a syllable that made passing ships lower their eyes. Couriers moved like punctuation between camps, and near Edirne, a foreign master, Orban by rumour, ambition by trade, persuaded bronze to become a voice lower than argument. Moulds were tamped, cores rammed, furnaces growled. When the first of those great mouths cooled to a dull glow, men who had trusted walls longer than they had trusted weather began to imagine uneasily what thunder might do to stone that had outlived so many tempests. In the city, the dust of these preparations had not yet arrived, but their rumour had, and Constantine, last of the name, last of that unhurried patience, walked the parapets with a calm that did not pretend ignorance, laying his palm on mortared joints as if feeling an elder's pulse. He called craftsmen to stitch what time had thinned, dragged fallen marble to give old ramparts new cheeks, taught gates to behave as if they had never known complacency. The chain across the golden horn, oiled and checked, rehearsed its slow geometry. In the harbours, galleys counted oars the way men inventory their virtues, without boasting, without apology. Within the nave that knows how to hold a whole city's breath, candles multiplied their small courage. Union had been signed beneath distant frescoes, and here, under a dome that prefers mercy to debate, the syllables of Rome and Constantinople shared a single chalice. Some knelt gladly, some grudgingly, some remained stubbornly seated, love refusing translation. Constantine, who had learned the grammar of compromise as sailors learn weather, received the sacrament with the composure of a steward loyal first to the house. Outside, dock workers argued theology in the dialect of bread, and grandmothers measured doctrine by the warmth it would lend a sick child. When Giovanni Justiniani came ashore, armour sounding like intention, the walls found in him competence they could trust, eyes that read trajectories, hands that believed in lime and timber, a will plain enough to say when a breach needed stones, not speeches. Together he and the emperor walked the circuit, counting promises rather than hours. Earth ramped against towers, mantlets raised, culverins sighted so that thunder might be answered by humbler thunder of their own. April unfolded its frank light, and from the land arrived a procession of tents that knitted the horizon into a fabric the city would not soon unsee, crescents and horsehair, pavilions orderly as grammar, oxen dragging bombards with the patient fatalism of beasts unconcerned with chronicles. The camp settled with a tidiness that felt like sentence structure. Artillery parks squared like arguments, trenches stitched toward the fosse in careful handwriting. The opening salvos spoke, testing stone as a physician tests bone. Walls long schooled by ladders and oaths learned a new percussion. Dust lifted in sighs, joints shivered and remembered themselves. At Vespers, choir boys tasted grit and sang anyway. Between bombardments, the besiegers prayed in rows that looked like furrows. Between salvos, the besieged processed icons along the battlements, their painted eyes refusing panic. Lanterns bobbed on night scaffolds, while carpenters persuaded timber into braces. Women boiled pitch and filled jars, with the slow fury of householders guarding thresholds. Monks bound wounds with linen torn from habits that had once kept winter out. Rations thinned and learned courtesy, bread sliced narrower, fish divided with the tact of neighbours. Yet someone always found a way to sweeten a child's cup with watered wine, because dignity often tastes like small kindness delayed until it matters most. In the blue pause before dawn, archers listened to the mathematics of water at the fosse. Engineers laid cheeks to earth to hear if sappers were murmuring below, and sentries rehearsed the gates like a rosary. Charisius, St. Romanos, Adrianople, Blackernay, where minds were heard, counterminds answered, where daylight showed through stone, sacks and beams, and an anonymous courage closed the light again. On the horn, the chain drew an iron underline beneath the moon, and the city slept easier for one clean line. But invention is a patient visitor. Watchers on Galata's slope saw hulls inching like stubborn thoughts over grease and soil, ships hauled from the Bosporus into the sheltered water past the chain, a new sentence written at the city's margin. The horn, which had been moat, learned surprise, booms were thrown, fire ships planned, night attacks rehearsed in whispers. Genoa kept neutrality as neatly as a ledger. Venice counted sails with professional grief. Astonishment, like fatigue, approached. In tides one must learn to swim. Days turned and were counted by impacts. The great bombard spoke, and the ground replied in its lowest register. Stones older than memory uncoupled with a tragic decorum. Dust settled over icons until saints looked, for an hour like masons. Justiniani, sleeves chalked with lime, moved men as a thoughtful cook moves flame under a pot. Here more heat, there hold. His unadorned voice taught panic to mend its manners. The emperor was everywhere at once, in the way only a watched man can be. On the wall with a pike, in the nave with a candle, in council with sentences that ended on time. He slept in short pages, woke when the bombard wrote another line, walked streets where shopkeepers offered him the courtesy of not noticing the exhaustion in their sovereign's face. Letters went out on boats that trusted dark, to islands that still felt kinship, to princes who weighed pity against profit, to anyone whose heart might be converted into grain. Some replies returned like water cupped in the hand. Some did not return at all. Still the city practiced itself. A woman touched the Chora's virgin, as one asks an elder to stay awake a little longer. A boy whose fingers had learned to gesso panels found consolation remain in muscle, even as plaster cracked. A hesychast breathed the name until his ribs discovered the kind of peace that does not deny the drum outside. A scholar traced with his forefinger the positions of Venus and the moon and thought, without offence, that beauty is stubborn. Swallows stitched tiny brackets across the paragraphs of stone. In the hippodrome, grass wrote its soft green script over arithmetic once shouted in colour. Sometimes the wind carried the other camp's voices, recitation, laughter, bowls, and siege resolved itself into two households cooking within sight of each other, each convinced that history prefers its kitchen. On such nights Constantine stood where city and sea converse, watching water choose a silver. He thought of emperors whose steps still haunt certain stairs, of boys who learned shields too soon, of his mother's hands. He rehearsed not heroics but decency, orders that spared, arrangements that fed, promises that would not embarrass the dead. When a bite opened near St. Romanos, he was there as well, passing baskets, lifting timbers, giving the small nods that keep men in their places without stealing their faces. The moon, obliging witness, lowered along the dome's curve, like a coin left on a saucer to settle an old account. Beyond the trenches, ladders were counted, mantlets mended, drums tested. Within the walls, lamps were trimmed, one by one, hands cupped round each wick, so flame would take the lesson. And somewhere above the sleeping roofs, where night keeps its ancient neutrality, a gull crossed from camp to city, and back again, ignorant of treaties, faithful only to wind, while at the join of land and sea, a door of cedar and iron waited, grave, patient, for the next knock. The nights grew thin, and a city that had practiced every grammar of endurance met the day that does not rehearse. By late May, the cannon found a tempo carpenters could no longer answer, and the ground, like an elder weary of courtesy, confessed its aches without persuasion. On the eve of the assault, a calm moved through the lanes with the hush of ceremony, doors latched by deliberate hands, neighbours divided their last loaves without commentary, and beneath Hagia Sophia's floating bowl of light nobles and fishmongers, monks and sailors, children taught to be brave, stood shoulder to shoulder, and let the liturgy gather them into one body. The union that had cost so much breath became a simple motion. Bread and wine offered to a people finished with argument and determined to be faithful. Constantine, faithful to his quiet decency, came forward without theatre, asked pardon, received it like a tool for dawn, and walked the nave with the measured attention of a steward closing shutters before weather. Outside, the moon rehearsed its old courtesies on marble and water. Inside, Greek and Latin braided into a single plea that sounded for a moment like confidence. Before first light, the drums began, measured, unhurried, as if morning itself had been drilled. Firepots sighed, ladders lifted like decisions. Along the battered band by the gate of Saint Romanos, the day's sentence composed itself in iron and breath. Justiniani, dust pale, moved his men with the economy of someone who knows panic wastes timber. Where palisade wavered, he lent the extra weight. Where a thumb of dawn pried through a breach, he pressed canvas and earth and courage until the whole remembered its manners. Constantine passed along the line, not like a statue come to life, but like a neighbour, pressing a shoulder, sharing a water skin, showing a boy with trembling hands how a pike steadies when the heart lowers its voice. Twice, thrice, the first waves broke, ladders abandoned like exhausted nouns under a paragraph of arrows, and the chant above the streets found its pitch so precisely that for a breath the city thought itself immortal. Then a patient mouth of bronze wrote a new clause. Stone yielded with a late sigh, smoke folded the air. Through the rent came a rush with more stubbornness than speed. Days like this turn on small hinges. A wound beneath Justiniani's harness loosened his strength. He asked to be bound and borne away. And in that confusion, a portion of the wall's will went with him. Rumour outran any runner. The Genoese captain fallen, the line thinning, the reserve not yet where the sentence needed its verb. Near the break, a gate called Kirke Porta, half forgotten, tended by habit, stood ajar or was pried ajar. Stories will disagree. Through that narrow grammar slipped men quick with opportunity, and on a parapet a banner climbed and clung like a bright contradiction. Constantine, who had been everywhere, chose to be only where he mattered. He put off the purple that betrays a body, spoke a last sentence about not abandoning the city, and stepped into the crush where swords decide in monosyllables. Those near him remembered not drama but courtesy, a nod, a lifted hand, a refusal to push past the frightened, and then the press closed like water. Later ages would dispute the how and where. The city, if asked, would say only that a good steward left the table clean. What follows is told in a slower voice. The chain lay across the horn like a thought that had held as long as it could. Galleys fled or yielded. In streets where lilies were sold yesterday, doors broke. The first screams rose, then thinned into the stunned quiet of a fate-changing key. In Hagia Sophia, the congregation felt a quake of boots and sobbed the prayer everyone knows by heart. A legend says an angel hid the chalice and entered the wall to wait for a gentler century, perhaps longing arranged as story, and harmless. Bronze doors cracked. The room that had taught centuries how to breathe received men who knew mostly how to shout. Relics were gathered by irreverent hands. Silk learned roughness. A child, lifted by a stranger, forgot to cry. Outside soldiers did what soldiers do when walls fail. Some merciful, some cruel, all too young. while trumpets began to argue in another language. By noon, a different order drew itself. Mehmed rode in with the composure of one who had believed this day while others debated it. At the western gate, he dismounted and touched his brow to earth, a gesture both personal and deliberate, and the city understood its next grammar would be strict, not careless. He forbade certain violences with the force of a man who knows victory misbehaves unsupervised. He stood beneath the great dome, not as desecrator, but as builder, taking the measure of a ceiling, then asked for prayer in his fashion, teaching the space a cadence, neither quick nor easily unlearned. Orders sounded like brooms. Sweep this quarter, spare that convent, postguards to the docks, recall men drunk on permission. Tally takers appeared, inked what could be restored. Scribes opened clean registers. A few Greek officials, cautious and needed, were told their skills still suited a city. The bronze horses would not return, but craftsmen were summoned. Baths would steam again. Markets would learn fresh arithmetic. A new name hovered, Istanbul, not so much a replacement as continuity pronounced from another mouth. Loss does not close a place, it inks its margins darker. In surviving houses, women counted the missing and set bread for the living. A monk found his hidden book and kissed it like a child unexpectedly spared. A boy, adrift in the first bewildered afternoon, pocketed a chip of porphyry as if it were a compass. Swallows resumed their errands on the land walls. In the harbour, fish turned beneath a flotilla, learning new commands. Evening smelled of ash, sweat, and strangely, broth. Somewhere a pot had been set, because households insist on duty, even when empires finish theirs. Lamps came on in new patterns. The muezzin's call braided with the last thin echo of a hymn. The water, pleased with many names, reflected both without choosing. What remained was another endurance, a long school of rebuilding beneath a different banner without surrendering memory of one's own. Mehmed would bring stonemasons and poets, laws attentive to detail, a vision broad enough for many tongues. Greeks who stayed would become necessary in the new arrangement, keeping accounts, baking bread, teaching children to pronounce old saints softly at night. Beyond the repaired gates, provinces that once took weather from Constantinople would read forecasts from Edirne and soon from the city itself, refashioned to deserve the straits. But not yet. Tonight the domes cool, the guns fall silent, and rain washes a little dust away. Somewhere a grandfather tells a child that cities, like people, change their names when their lives turn. Somewhere a young architect dreams of making stone sing in a key both new and familiar, and on a sill above a quiet lane a cracked tile holds one last coin of moonlight, a small, stubborn brightness waiting for the next page to turn. After the day that revised the city's grammar, life resumed its modest arithmetic. Mornings opening ovens, markets lifting their awnings, baptisms and errands finding their intervals, and memory, that durable craft, moved into quieter rooms to do its patient work. Mehmed measured stone with a scholar's caution, drawing his capital like a net that would not tear, and Topkapi rose as a lesson in courtyards where thresholds taught footsteps to lower their voice. The name Istanbul, soft around the edges like a word warmed on the tongue, learned to mean not only conquest, but a house large enough for many keys. Hagia Sophia, robed in a new brightness, and veiled in places where old colours slept intact, taught prayer to ride the dome in a different cadence while minarets tried their skyward music and found the sea willing to sing with them. In the lanes where bakers always wake first, ovens kept their truce with dawn. Greeks remained as necessary as salt, accountants and shipwrights, surgeons and chandlers. whispering old saints as lullabies, even as they fingered a new calendar with steady hands. The empire that had been Rome in Greek learned to live as a millet, a community dignified by its own law within a larger house, and the patriarchate took up residence among lamps that had already watched other sovereignties, bishops becoming again the kind of mayors history requires whenever thrones change clothes. Across the water, Athos kept its breath, hesychasts measuring the hours, with a weightless prayer while scribes nested manuscripts like eggs under the kindly heat of lamp and intention. In Mistra, before its quieting, Plethon had called Plato as if inviting a friend back from travel, and that spark followed pupils and pages west, when maps forced choices, Bessarion carrying codices like embers into Italian libraries, Chrysoloras teaching Latin ears to love Greek vowels again, so that in chancelleries and salons shutters opened, and the Renaissance, crowded with fathers and rich in weather, found in these arrivals the grammar it had long thirsted for, a logic for light, a taste for measured proportion, an appetite for argument that honours its elders. In Moscow, beard-iced and deliberate, a court took a bride from the old line, Sophia Palaiologina, and dreamed the phrase Third Rome as inheritance of idea rather than estate, while a double-headed eagle, winter-sure, unembarrassed, unfurled above snow. None of this unmade the Bosporus's ash of grief, but grief, which has its own pedagogy, proved endings are also instructions. Meanwhile, Crete chanted long in Venetian nights, Candia's workshops giving saints both Byzantine stillness and Western air, as if faces themselves could be bridges. The Morea quieted, Trebizond yielded its blue balcony, and monasteries shifted from acres to alphabets, from estates to endurance. In the Fana, where shoes learned to walk carefully, families practiced diplomacy as a household art. The Fanariates, serving as dragomans and governors, translators of meaning in a world that needed interpreters more than conquerors, balancing two metaphors at once. Like trays, the law of the house, Ottoman, exact, made space for the law of the room. Orthodox, stubborn, so that saints' days threaded lanes, where the call to prayer greeted them without surprise. Baklava borrowed almonds from neighbours and returned the favour in fish and fennel. And Sinan, gravity tamed by grace, drew domes that remembered the mathematics of Hagia Sophia without imitation. Archers conversing across centuries without jealousy. Scholars kept the city's afterlife tidy, copying homilies with the same patience, once given to imperial edicts. Printers, late to arrive, tested type against a language that prefers curvature to hurry. The chant refused museum air and outlived empire because it had never required empire, only ears and a willingness to listen until sorrow settled. Grandmothers taught grammar with recipes. Schools behind courtyards let a new alphabet of state coexist with the old script of prayer, and in shipyards the pitch and salt indifference to theology served piety by refusing to care. On feast days, Greeks circled tables with low songs, naming ports like relatives. On Fridays, the city folded itself toward mercy, and at sunset minarets lifted copper-orange seams while swallows stitched delighted commas in the air. Continuity living not only in libraries, but in the way a street learns generosity to footsteps. Beyond the domes and orchards, the Byzantine idea travelled as a diaspora of habits, respect for argument, economies moderated by custom, a holiness that prefers discipline to spectacle, Lawyers in Dubrovnik cited rights rinsed through Constantinople like rain through stone. Canonists in Wallachia straightened lines with compasses forged in imperial courts. Historians in Padua kept their wars in elegant Latin, while confessing that Greek thought moves like water around hard facts. Greek merchants in Odessa balanced ledgers that smelled faintly of myrtle and clove. Schoolmasters in Ioannina drilled Homer and Luke in the same breath. Island painters laid gold leaf over bowl, with hands remembering apprenticeships older than passports. And Istanbul, because cities choose their character with or without permission, became a place of overlay rather than erasure. A madrasa took the footprint of a palace hall, a hammam reoccupied Roman pipes, cisterns drank a new century without complaint, walked the maze with eyes closed 2 generations on, and you could feel processional rhythm in shop spacing, the distance between baker and smith still speaking the old ceremony of bread and blade. On rainy afternoons, wet limestone smelled faintly of him. On winter mornings, the Bosporus wore a blade of light that might have made Basil smile. The city learned a virtue Byzantium had long practiced: patience without complacency, courtesy without surrender, loss becoming predicate under which new subjects could be understood. And always, in drawers where households keep last fine cloths and tender photographs, something small endured, a bone relic wrapped in a mother's scarf, a gospel page annotated by a hand that knew both commerce and consolation, a coin too worn to spend yet too faithful to discard. Children were taught not that an empire would return, that is a cruelty, but that its kindness could be kept, its literate fierceness carried forward, its art of balancing heaven and bureaucracy practiced wherever neighbours share walls. So when, centuries later, Greek freedom flared, it carried the heat of revolt and the perfume of remembered courtyards. And when Russia or Romania or Serbia argued law and altar, Constantine's dilemmas looked back from the mirror and nodded gravely. Toward evening, a pedagogue in the Fana closed his lesson and watched pupils run towards soup. A Ligurian in Galata whispered a prayer that did not mind which language replied. A dervish in Uskudar turned slow circles that would have pleased desert monks. The water, exact, unsentimental, carried every layered name without confusion, and somewhere, in a lecture hall where a tired young poet compared Plato's cave to a lantern-lit cistern, the thin gold line between what had ended and what continued shone steady enough to write by. While the night raised its soft blue, lamps woke like patient stars, and in the hush between one century's breath and the next, a scholar smoothing a palimpsest thought about how debates survive defeat, how a people's disagreements tended gently can become their most durable inheritance, as a bell and a call braided themselves over roofs, and a page turned with the sound of silk. If you linger in the room of history after the lamps have been lowered, you can hear the soft murmur of conversations that refuse to sleep, and for this many-named city, 5 of them return like friendly tides. The first begins with a question that sounds almost harmless until you swear to answer it precisely. When did Rome become this? Some place the hinge at 330. When Constantine laid New Rome upon the Bosporus, and the empire's compass learned to face the light from the east, others point to the 7th century, when Greek replaced Latin in chancery and temperament, when themes overtook provinces, and the old Mediterranean grammar divided into new clauses. A third school smiles and says it never ceased to be Rome at all, only altered the music of its certainty, kept the coin and the law and the stubborn self-name Romaioi, while dreaming in another tongue. The same texts go obediently with each argument, edicts and coin legends, council minutes and street names, and perhaps the most faithful answer is the tidal one. Identity leaves many wet marks on the same stone, and none of them lie. The second quarrel, mournful, even when it sharpens, gathers beneath the gold of icons. Why did a people who loved colour sometimes send faces into hiding, piety grown strict, say some, devotion wary of misdirected love, corrected by desert wind, politics and purse, say others, imperial suspicion of monastic acres, defeats hunting moral reasons, a court tiding devotion for administrative ease, evidence tilts like a mobile, by daylight toward theology, by night toward power. The wiser confession may be that fear and faith walked the same road for a while, that policy borrowed a halo, and zeal borrowed a sceptre, and that the eventual triumph of images owed less to argument than to a city remembering its own best tone for speaking with God. In museums and dusk-bright chapels the tesserae keep counsel. The painted eyes look back, and with their kind patience forgive our need to make conclusions behave like doors. The third debate spreads its papers like harvest. Was this economy a quilt of resilience or a cloth frayed by privilege? One tradition praises an art of moderation, granaries smoothing famine, coinage altered without panic, the theme's marriage of farm and frontier, trade teaching silk and oil to travel sensibly. Another traces the afternoon growth of great estates that lengthen shadows over smallholders, the pronoia, coaxing obligation away from the centre, the breath sold to Italian communes until local lungs grew short. Archaeologists lift roofs on hill villages nimble enough to last, chart ports that brighten when routes turn. Fiscal historians run a finger down ledgers where the ink thins in some reigns and grows confident in others. Perhaps the empire's peculiar genius was to conserve the middle, holding extremes at a respectful distance until chance or powder named a price that thrift could not pay. The fourth argument is about neighbours who called themselves kin. Was the detour of 1204 the fatal cut, or only the deepest among many? Some say the Latin sack unthreaded the garment, treasuries spilled, artisans scattered, a century of exiles stitching continuity in Nicaea, while the old capital learned to speak rents to strangers. Others, sterner, answer that Manzikert had already moved the spine, Anatolia's loss, bleeding grain, and men past any easy bandage. A third, with a grim courtesy, allows both keys to be true, and hears 1453 as a conclusion written by Powder in the margins of a much older manuscript. Walk the land walls and you can hear each story speak, the 7th century in one seam, the 13th in another, the 15th pressed across the stones. The ramparts refuse to choose. They merely present their scars like notches on a staff. The fifth is the most intimate, because it asks what a state believes about itself. Was this polity a throne wrapped in theatre, or a rule of law stubbornly humane beneath purple cloth? Travellers unkind to ceremony saw only choreographed obeisance, eunuchs for valves, edicts falling like weather from an unreachable sky. Others, reading manuals and casebooks, find the counter melody, Justinian's code, pruned and harmonized into the basilica. Judges cautioned to hear the human timbre, inside property and contract. Widows guarded not merely on parchment, but gloriously often in practice, a bureaucracy that behaved less like a maze than a city's long memory. If truth keeps its home where truth prefers, near the middle distance, then sovereignty here wore a crown and a schedule, but it also wore notaries' patience, guilds' tact, and clerks' modest courage in copying what conscience considered binding. Listen longer, and other voices take a chair. Chemists asking what Greek fire really was, naphtha and saltpeter and secrecy, or something stranger still. Demographers tracing plague's shadow and pleading for modest numbers. Theologians, revisiting unions not as betrayals but as painful attempts to sew a family back together. Strategists, arguing whether pronoia was feudalism in Greek clothing or its own angular animal. None of them seem eager to win. They want the conversation to stay hospitable enough that the living can visit without embarrassment, and in that, perhaps, the empire wins its last quiet victory. It taught curiosity good manners. Outside the seminar of the mind, the city, whatever name you choose, goes on being itself. Fishermen count a silver dawn with the same care an archivist counts seals. A chanter rehearses a mode that learned to live in exile without turning bitter. A child on a ferry watches domes and minarets share a sky and senses, blessedly free of terminology, that continuity is less a trick of words than a habit of kindness. The 5 old arguments roll back like tidewater, promising to return when evening knocks. Swallows stipple the walls with moving commas, and the stones keep no grudges. The water breathes evenly. Somewhere, in a narrow room where one lamp is sufficient, a reader closes a book on this civilization as tenderly as one settles a sleeping friend. And beyond the window, the Bosporus lays a single band of moonlight from shore to shore, as if underlining a sentence that is not quite finished saying what it means. Misunderstandings travel lighter than truths. They wear good coats, keep their papers in order, and slip across frontiers without declaring anything. So this city, with its patience, its domes, its practiced courtesy, has learned to collect a bouquet of errors that return each century like migratory birds. The first says it was only a scented corridor after Rome, an antechamber where incense bargained with silk, while nothing of consequence occurred. But listen to the quiet arithmetic of the Xenodochia counting beds, ladles, rules for washing, or read a widow's petition climbing through courts without being taxed by bribes, and you will hear law breathing in time with mercy, the workaday choreography of a state that understood both grain and grace. The second insists it squandered itself on theology while the world moved on. Yet in those careful quarrels, people learned to speak with unflinching tenderness about person and will, about freedom and likeness. Vocabulary later borrowed by parliaments and contracts when they needed a way to keep power from treading on the human spine. A third flicks Byzantine as a shrug, crooked corridors and clever traps, as if complexity were vice. Here, complexity was often the instrument of compassion, the layered procedure by which many provinces, tongues, and devotions were kept from cutting one another with simple rules forged for smaller rooms. Another era paints iconoclasm as either noble cleansing or senseless vandalism. Lived days were slower, sadder. Painters tucked faces into initials and geometry. Abbots taught their houses to wait without souring into hate. Neighbours lowered voices at wells. When images returned, it felt less like conquest than like an old timbre restored to a choir that had learned to sing around the missing note. There is the slur that its arms were effete, but the land walls held because ordinary men practiced the homely math of garrison life, measuring grain, darning boots, rotating watches. While Varangian axes did their doorframe work at the gate, dromons kept their pact with the sea, and Greek fire wrote bright commas on dark water when storms of men required punctuation. Others imagine an economy forever leaking into Italian purses, a wicker basket of coin. The ledgers breathe stricter truth. State granaries dulling famine's blade. Mints changing recipes without frightening markets. Inspectors obliging scales to tell the truth. Tariffs revised with the tact that lets bazaars live and nights be sleepable. The harshest falsehood says the sack of 1204 was deserved, a moral invoice presented at last. Walk the quarter where bronze horses once remembered chariot thunder, imagine a grandmother lowering her icon into a cistern to keep it from flame, and tell me desserts and punishments are the right grammar for that day. Another favourite claims it closed its shutters against the Renaissance. Yet, the very manuscripts that woke Italian mornings, Plato rubbed smooth by devotion, physicians annotated in 2 alphabets, crossed west in the satchels of monks and scholars who had learned, under domes and lamp smoke, how to make memory portable. Even the ending attracts its busy myths. That the last steward begged or fled, ask those who saw him apologise before communion, share a waterskin on the wall, lift a palisade with ash on his sleeves and step into the crush where swords decide in monosyllables they will choose other verbs, kept, tended, stayed. There are more burrs that cling to the cloak. That superstition eclipsed science. Tell that to men who copied Galen until herbs could answer in Latin and Greek, to shipwrights teaching timber the grammar of curve and stress, to an astronomer on a cold balcony drawing a faithful moon. That schism was a single slammed door, when in truth footnotes grew into paragraphs, paragraphs into habits, habits into neighbourhoods that still traded fish and courtesies across a theological hedge. Against these bright, portable mistakes the city offers the weight of its ordinary day, a judge hearing not just the letter but the human timbre beneath it, a mason tapping a brace into tired stone, a baker dividing a loaf so evenly both halves feel grateful, a scribe lifting his face from the page because a stubborn ligature finally agreed to behave. Truth arrives here without trumpets. It opens shutters, lets the Bosporus lay its long silver ruler along the sill, and asks you to measure again. Stand under the dome some morning and watch light lower its voice across marble. Turn into a side street at dusk and hear chant and haggling coexist without bruising. Hold a coin smoothed by 100 careful palms and feel how complexity, handled gently, becomes courtesy rather than trap. Misconceptions prefer rooms without windows. This city makes windows everywhere, arches that host both wind and prayer, and when night climbs the straits and wets the stone with the clean grammar of salt, the old errors, suddenly heavy, set themselves down and do not travel so well, while along the parapet swallows stitch the air with small dark commas, and the moon draws a precise underline on the water, as if correcting a sentence we have repeated too easily. Popular memory, devoted to glitter and brevity, has dressed this empire in many borrowed costumes, and most of them, though gorgeous, forget to breathe. On painted stages, emperors stride through curtains of incense, while courtiers murmur like obedient fountains. Theodora wears the moon for earrings and delivers revelations she never spoke. Generals declaim speeches, no chronicle preserved, but audiences adore. In such theatres, intrigue outshines endurance, and the slow labour of centuries, tax ledgers, treaties, harvests, classrooms, waits in the wings unlit. Opera gives thunder and tears, novels supply corridors with secrets, cinema raises the great dome again in pixels and glow. Sometimes, by accident or grace, they catch something true, how morning enters Hagia Sophia like an idea made visible, how incense, half prayer, half chemistry, teaches light to hold still, how marble remembers every procession it has ever held. More often, the eye hungers for collapse, for velvet endings, and forgets that endurance is its own spectacle, the longest-running performance of all. The new chroniclers, video games, offer their devotions differently. Walls are mapped with granular honesty. The chain across the horn is drawn like a theorem. Cannons speak the grammar of thunder. A player comes to know where gates stood and how hulls slid under bridges of flame. Yet no joystick teaches the archivist's silence, the bent-back coaxing centuries into coherence. Museums fare better, their glass is clean, their lighting kind. Icons hang at human height, gold still carrying the memory of a palm. Silks lie in quiet folds with a faint perfume of myrrh and dust. Labels refrain from shouting. A child touches a column drum and hears without naming it the hum of the old city's patience. In cafes, Byzantine still means tangled, deceitful, slow, until under the same brass rims, 5 faiths drink from cups side by side, and the word begins to reclaim itself, remembering that complexity and harmony are cousins. Poets and painters have noticed they make the empire not a labyrinth but a mosaic, each piece distinct yet leaning into the next until coherence happens quietly. In poems, glass tesserae become metaphors for forgiveness. In novels, a monk debates an icon and discovers both are mirrors for a restless heart. In music, a lone drone bears the weight of centuries like a patient mule. And the city, alive beneath its new names, smiles at these retellings because it knows every generation invents the Byzantium it needs, or fears, or secretly envies. Some read a cautionary tale of pride, others are hymns to continuity, others a mirror of their own complexity. None are wrong, all are incomplete. The real city refuses to fit any screen. It can only be walked, stone underfoot, salt in the air, the slow heartbeat of oars in the straits. Walk and myth softens. Domes and markets and echoing baths hum with something quieter than grandeur, decency, perhaps, or discipline, a courtesy so practiced that even the ruins uphold it. Evening settles, films dim their credits, novels close their covers, screens go dark, and out on the ferries the true lights appear. Domes and minarets share one horizon, like companions grown wise enough not to argue. Gulls etch white punctuation across the sentence of dusk. Water folds east and west into a single shimmering paragraph. Stand there and the story needs no narrator. The city tells itself, patient and fluent. It says softly, all empires are temporary, hospitality is not. And the straits, faithful as ever, take that sentence on their back and carry it into the dark. The night has thinned to that soft hour when streets learn whispering and windows carry their small moons from room to room. And after so much walking together, it feels right to loosen our pace and let the city speak while we listen with a quieter kind of attention. We have kept company with soldiers who measured maps like prayers, with judges who heard the human timbre under the letter of law, with painters who taught light how to behave like tenderness, and we have stood among stones that remember 5 languages of weather and still maintain their courtesy in the rain. So what remains is not a summary so much as a way of standing, a posture of mind learned from a place that survived by arranging beauty and duty in the same room. The lesson the city keeps offering is small and durable, almost shy. Endurance prefers fidelities that do not announce themselves. A market weight that tells the truth, so bread is fairly sliced. A clerk who refuses the easy coin and files the honest form. A mason who comes back at dusk with a wooden mallet, taps a brace into a tired arch, and nods when the sound returns clean. A mother dividing figs so perfectly that both halves feel chosen. A singer keeping the pitch level enough that anxious hearts can rest inside it. These are not fireworks, they are firewood. They are the daily combustion by which long stories stay warm. The unshowy exactness that keeps catastrophe from learning to speak in the local accent. And woven through endurance is the city's other art, the one our age still misnames, complexity as hospitality. where many tongues and rites meet. Simple rules cut flesh. Better, the Byzantines learned, to layer courtesy the way a mosaic layers glass, small pieces, edges softened by glue and gold, so that the surface welcomes the gaze without breaking it. A procession that knows how to pause for a cart, a court that allows a second hearing so the poor can find their breath, a tax revised not to strangle a market but to let nights be sleepable, complexity not as a maze but as an ethic of making room. Watch that choreography long enough and your own breathing slows. You remember the old skill of living near others without bruising them. Of course there were failures. How could there not be? Riots that made noon brittle, edicts that mistook precision for justice, treaties written with a hand too quick for mercy, yet even failure learned its manners in time. Faces returned to walls after years of shyness. Exiles came home with thriftier hearts. Enemies became suppliers. Then neighbours. Then names spoken without a wince. Forgiveness here was infrastructural. It lived in reopened baths, in shutters reseated true, in summonses trusted again to call the living rather than the wrathful. If heaven is a city at peace with itself, then perhaps this earthly one, by 1,000 nightly corrections, glimpsed a workable blueprint. And now, after so many seasons, the name has changed, but the water has not. The skyline has learned new syllables without unlearning the old key. Ferries write their slow sentences across the strait, and people from every direction lean against the same rail and grow briefly kinder. Stand there near evening, and you will see how domes and minarets share a horizon without quarrel, how gulls stitch white commas through the paragraph of dusk, how the Bosporus lays a silver underline from shore to shore, as if insisting that continuity is not a trick of memory, but a courtesy the world extends to itself when it wants to remain habitable. You may find your breath keeping time with the water, and know, with the quiet certainty reserved for simple truths, that cities teach what books only remind: patience, restraint, the noble labour of ordinary days. Let us part, then, with 3 rooms kept like small heirlooms. In the first, a scribe lifts his face from a page, breathes gently until the ink dims to a faithful mat, and closes the codex with the care one uses to settle a sleeping bird. Tomorrow another hand, perhaps yours, will open it and find the words still warm. In the second, a workshop that smelled of pitch at noon smells of bread at night. As shipwright runs his palm along a seam he caulked at sunset, feels the tack he hoped for, and hears in that quiet resistance a tidy argument for hope. In the third, a child on a ferry points to the skyline, one shape older than grandparents, another young as his questions, and the parent answers, not with lesson but with naming, letting the water finish the thought. The child grows quiet, and it is enough. The house of this story has many doors. You can re-enter by a hymn or a recipe, by a legal clause, or a broken coin made honest by 100 careful palms, by a museum label, or by standing under rain at the land walls to read the patient script of moss, by closing your eyes while a single line of chant lowers a plumb for the heart. However you return, the city will not hurry you. It never has. It will set a chair by the window and offer the old view. Water rehearsing neutrality. Stone practicing its manners. Light lowering its voice across marble so that even grief can listen without flinching. If sleep is already near, take the strait as metronome. Inhale with the arriving ferry. Exhale with the leaving wake. Let the dome hold a coin of moon for you. Let the walls keep your worry as a deposit they know how to guard. And when morning comes, as it always does, you may find the gentlest thing this long road has taught is also the bravest. that courtesy is a kind of architecture, that truths told quietly outlast the loudest hour, and that the work of keeping a world together happens in hands so ordinary we forget to see them shining. The lamp can dim now, the city knows the rest of the sentence. Outside your window, the water draws one last thoughtful line of light from shore to shore, signing without haste the name you have been listening to all along.